Everybody back home. Just started the recording. And let's see. Hey, how you doing, Shema? And Kenitra. Said hello to everyone, Jennifer and Kevin. Okay, so we got some slides here. Let's pop over there for a little bit and I'll come back in. See if we got, nice fun framing also for this webinar. And then we're going to skip next week, but it's July 4th on Tuesday next week. And then Liz is going to do her Amazon on Monday. So I'll be off for 1 week. And we'll see whether you miss me or whether you're just relieved to have the week off too. But then next week we can discuss very possibly the same topic. We'll see how far we get and how well we do here, but it gets to the heart of things away. We're in a sense going to be talking about how to know what's true, but we're going to, as I said in the topic of the webinar up here, do what I said here. I got in this little window that, wait. Oh, this is an old one. That's an old one. But let's see here. I don't know if that was, anyway, the link for today is in the chat box and GoToWebinar if anyone needs it. Hey, Justin. Good morning. So at the top in my post, I said that today's topic, people think, plan, and act and pursue goals without a mental immune system to effectively filter out ideas and then decisions and beliefs and actions that people could have known with just a little bit of a toolbox that you could have. Then you'll be able to filter out enough stuff, I think, enough bad ideas, decisions, things like that, bad frames, whereas I put on this slide, it's really not hard at all to be in at least the top 10%. And if you've heard me talk about like semi-soft locks, which is the idea and strategy of where if you're going after a final goal, like winning in some way or making money or whatever it might be, then what I like to do is identify something where if I could achieve that final goal, possibly, then pick a sub goal, something that's quite reachable, something like with SEO consulting, if you want to have 20 clients paying you a certain amount of money or whatever as like a bigger goal, that a semi-soft lock might just be ranking a website, getting a website onto page 1 of Google. And if you're confident from there, you generally get to 20 clients if you think about it. And then even if you say, well, maybe that wouldn't be fully enough to guarantee that. Again, I said confident, not guarantee with a semi-soft lock. And then, but the other thing is that if you feel like you need another sub goal, then you just do it at that point. For sure, ranking something on the first page of Google for some keyword is, if you could get to 20 clients, then that's directly on the way, what I just talked about. And it's only going to help that it's achievable. It's the kind of goal that if you go all in on it enough, then you can for sure achieve it. So with the tools that I'm generally giving you, and then I'll hone in on today, you're going to just be able to cut out enough kind of crap that you can pretty much assure yourself that whatever kind of niche you pick, either with work or, career-wise, metaphorically with other places in life, that you could just be in the top 10%. Not that we're trying to settle for that, and not that in many cases, you want to divorce your accomplishments and your goals from comparing with other people in the first place, right? It's typically not relevant. It typically can be misleading, whatever. For example, if you want to cure cancer, you don't want to cure cancer better than most doctors. You just want to cure cancer, right? It's not relevant how other people are doing. On the other hand, when we're thinking about making money, it's an interesting semi-soft lock way to look at it. If you think, look, if I can understand why it is that I can be in the top 10% of whatever thing I focus on doing, in particular Amazon niche, Amazon in general, right? If you could become one of the top 10% of the sellers or whatever. And then once you have that sense, then you just need to pick something where if you are in the top 10%, then you'll be fine. You'll make enough money if you're talking about money, or if you can, might be an odd thing to say, but there's a kind of basic, simple truth to it, even in terms of dating and relationships. If you're out there, if you're in the top 10% of your general age category or whatever category, you can at least figure, look, I can find someone that matches me decently and so forth. And then you can let it go at there. It is like a little bit of a shortcut or hack that I'm giving you, but it can help frame why we're talking about this stuff, one of the reasons. And the nice thing is you can certainly leave this whole 10% thing behind as well. But worst case, the nice thing is it puts a nice little floor underneath your sense of things in life, right? Because if you can for sure be in the top 10% with various stuff, and you pick something where top 10% is fine, or if you can we could change it to 1%, right? You hone in on this stuff even better. then you can, in many cases, if you, in most anything where you're not starting incredibly far behind with like kind of a permanent advantage, playing basketball or something, for some of us might be a pro basketball or whatever, we'd be too far behind. But then if you just knew that you could do that 10%, 5%, 1%, then you could stop worrying about things, right? You would just go ahead and succeed in a way that you just feel calm and not worry about stuff. And because, you know, a lot of us feel confident plenty of time, but then there are those times that we don't. And I like to have a plan for those times as well. The framing is something, that type of framing can just help you. I haven't really gotten to the main topic yet, but I'm just framing the main topic with what we're talking about in this slide. But this framing of, if I can get in the top 10%, right? If I have a method, then it can motivate you for what we're talking about the rest of this webinar and give it a tangible thing. But then also it's something to remind yourself of when it's something tough or you're dejected or whatever, right? Some days you just wake up if you're anything like me, right? And you just have less energy, feel a little bit more depressed than normal or whatever. And what we really need is a way to get through those times, right? Like all of us can get through most of our day, most days, and at least vast majority of us, right? We're not depressed all the time, right? We're not lacking confidence to a decent degree in the parts of life we need to constantly, but we want something. And so I like things that kind of give a bit of a floor, something to fall back. So worst case, let's shoot for this, right? And look at what I'm talking about here as where we could see how people without these tools, if you have the tools that we're going over together and that we'll go over in this webinar and the next, then again, it can kind of give you a way to think about why, like something tangible to put together with why we'd want to start to think about an immune system for cutting out wrong ideas, right? And so, okay, moving on to the next slide. This is going to be interesting for you guys. As I've mentioned, things that really fit together. I have almost like a unified theory of success, our mind, goals, and so forth. Maybe not even almost. I really understand how things fit together now. It isn't that I have every detail or know everything about it, but there's a whole outline that really works and it's rooted and so forth. And what I'm going to point out here will be a symptom of this kind of integrated understanding I have. And this is what I'm referring to here on this slide. I'll just read the slide for anyone that's on an MP3 and so forth. I have 3 questions that they end up relating. They all have a similar form. The first question is, when is the only time feelings don't matter at all? Then I wrote, when is the only time that default, another word that we want to become more tangible, want to have more angles on, we're more integrated in our thinking, is the idea of default as I mean it, right? So we'll delve into that here. When is the only time default doesn't matter? And then I wrote, when do we not need to be realistic about our goals? That's going to end up relating to. Before I said I was going to read it, what was I saying? Oh, think of Spock. I've been watching Big Bang Theory and the guys in that, Star Trek and Star Wars, and one of them particularly idolizes Spock, right? Sheldon on there. And so the idea of Spock in Star Trek, I'm not like a big Trekkie, but probably most of us know, at least the character, right? It's pretty famous at this point. So the idea with Spock is that he uses like cold reason, right? He doesn't let emotion get in the way of his logic, and that his whole race, I think it's Vulcans, if I have it right, is like that, right? The Klingons are the bad guys, right? Or whatever. But so anyway, so there's that idea. And that just is a tangible icon to this idea of emotion versus reason, or different people with different political views might say the other one just listens to their feelings instead of thinking, and then you think and not feel, or like this person, they just feel, they don't think. But we can make those statements symptomatically, or we can think about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like the idea of Spock. In practice, no one really does that, right, or achieves it, right? If you try to just ignore your feelings, and then it doesn't really work, right? And feelings actually matter greatly when you understand the idea of default, right? And I've given the illustration of like current in the ocean if you're sailing, which it's not the only angle on default, and I don't want your entire understanding of default to just come down to only picturing current in an ocean, but it starts to give indication of what I mean, is the idea of ignoring currents just with your attitude or something is not relevant, because the current is there whether you want to ignore it or not. The default stuff that you notice, the default conclusions that your mind brings that come to mind, but just what you notice, right? Like when you wake up in the morning, there's just all sorts of habits and things that you'll think and possibilities for that day. And there's so much outside of that. It isn't even you want to be aware of all of it anyway, right? Saying, oh, or the you ever see a movie where they're referring to like spy training or something like that, like secret agent training, where they're like, you have to learn to be aware of everything, right? You can't be aware of everything. Like our brain needs to narrow it down, right? If you were aware of stock and it going up and down every second, then that would be an example of being aware of everything, right? And it would just be on and on, trying to be aware of everything, every bird that's chirping and right and so forth. People with OCD, their brain makes them very aware of these little anomalies, right? That they feel like in the environment, right? There's something, a painting isn't straight or whatever it might be. Someone has something on their chin, whatever, and they get overly fixated on that. So noticing the wrong things or feeling too strongly about noticing things isn't helpful. So merely noticing more, depending on what someone means by being more conscious or something like that, anything that means noticing just more what are they ignoring that I talked about a lot? They're ignoring alternative use, right? I don't mean that someone who's using that phrase become more conscious is wrong. I'm just saying that if what someone means or how it's interpreted is just being more aware, like the idea of being more aware isn't, again, it ignores alternative use. So that's how we can know that it's missing the point. When I talk about people, like when someone says you have to focus more or work harder, every time you make a statement like that where you're ignoring alternative use, you guys now know that statement is deficient. It isn't that it's wrong. It might be exactly what you need to hear is to focus more. The practical meaning of what the person might be saying, which is put more resource in this place, might be correct. But if it's meant or interpreted to be ignoring alternative use, then you know that, and it's very common that people do that, right? The more we understand how our brain works naturally and in a way that's not wrong, but that we want to work with, it is actually going to ignore alternative use because it's trying to narrow things down. It's trying to create certainty out of uncertainty. That's what our brain does. We need to learn how to work with that properly. When you're trying to create a feeling of tangibility, right? If you feel totally indecisive in a situation where you can't know what the right choice is, then you'll feel paralyzed. And so what our brain does is it tends to exclude, marginalize, delete, right? Focus us in on certain things so that we feel more confident. And you can test this, and I refer to this. It's just a fact that people feel more confident than they should, given just truth of answers. I'm not saying they should practically, because maybe that helps them take action in a way. But if you just give people tests, like I've talked about, where they make more cocoa, where do they grow more cocoa? In Brazil or in Africa, right? In South America or in Africa. And you just give people a test like that, then what's going to happen? Regardless of how well they do on a test, let's say they get 6% of the answers right, they'll probably, if you separately have them rate their confidence for each answer, their average confidence will probably be 80%. They got 6% of the test, right? So there's just a simple symptom of our brain, but it's a basic trick. Our brain, and that people don't generally realize in this way, it's part of my model, is to understand that our brain, our mind is trying to create certainty, kind of fabricate certainty for us. We want to learn how to work with that without getting trapped by it. We want to embrace it, but not be limited to it. We want to learn how to work with it. There's another part of the puzzle that we need. We put them together, but we don't want to deny it either. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, getting back to the main thread here. We're talking about, we talk about becoming more aware, becoming more conscious. That's not quite right. It ignores alternative resource. I talked about how our brain is built in a way that by default, it's going to have us ignore alternatives in order to focus us in on one thing so that we go do something, right? So that we survive and don't just stand there picking our navel when it's survival time. We're going to want to take all this into account as we build our kind of unified theory about how all this works and how we work with our mind properly. So it's not, and when we have our unified theory, when we understand how things work, what we're not going to want to just do is conclude something overly simplistic, like we just need to be more aware, right? So instead, we need to figure out how to have an alternative use type of something that takes into account alternative use. When it comes to feelings, and it's not just feeling, when I talk about feelings, you wake up and you feel like certain things matter and you have certain habits and there's a certain structure to your life where you don't even consider going out and applying for a job at the local zoo. Even if that would be the thing that would make you most happy, it never would cross your mind for most or all of us, right? Merely being aware of now, if I said you need to be aware of every job opportunity, how are you going to do that? You're going to sit there then you'd have to spend like hours and hours trying to become aware of every job opportunity, right? And compare that with every entrepreneur. What if I said you have to be aware of every opportunity, every job opportunity, every entrepreneurial opportunity, etc.? You couldn't do that, right? But what that means is that when I take it to the extreme in that way, it helps us to notice, which is that we're naturally and necessarily quite restricted in our choices by the current state of our mind. The current, when I say state, I don't even mean mindset. All the associations, everything you've learned, all your habits, your whole life up till now, plus your environment, your peers, all that. That all adds up, all your associations, memories, ideas, beliefs, and all that. It adds up to the default way that you're headed each day with your decisions and so forth. To deny that exists is absurd. You need to embrace it, realize it, understand it, and work with it. But you can't just throw it out and say you got to be aware of everything or anything like that. Or to say, oh, feelings don't matter. That, again, you pretend that feelings don't matter. You're just going to act as if they matter because your feelings, to say that your feelings don't matter would mean you can't tell the difference between whether you should, like, you go by feel. I was going to say apply for a job at the zoo or something. You go by feel constant. If you take away someone's sense of feel if you give someone Botox, they're less able to understand what other people are thinking because the way that people do that is they move their own facial muscles. I'm not saying do or don't take Botox. It's just a side of it. We move our own facial muscles in order to have a sense of reading other people's minds without realizing it. Our brain does it automatically. We can go over, if we thought it through, we can come up with example after example where if you didn't have any feeling of what to do, if you had no default motion, there would just be stillness. And whereas some philosophies might imply that's what you want, a default stillness in every way would be nonsensical. You would have no motion to harness. Imagine if you were totally still and then someone said, do you want ice cream? As soon as they said that, you would have to either no longer feel still or else you would literally have no idea if you wanted ice cream. And that means you wouldn't want it. And that would have to apply to everything. If the wonderful member of the opposite significant other, potential significant other, or your own came up to you and was like, do you want to hop into bed? I'm really excited about having sex with you right now. If you had no default whatsoever, you would be like, I have no idea. And even given that you say that, I still have no idea, right? Lack of motion must mean there continues to be a lack of motion. If you're still, but if someone comes up to you, says something, and that makes you not still anymore, then you're not really still. You might have been resting, but you had a default that got triggered, right? If nothing can get triggered, now you're still and you're going to stay still, and nothing's going to happen, and you have no motivation. You can't have joy. You can't have anything. So there can't be this idea of like stillness, no matter what, is nonsense. So we have a default and we feel our way through that default, and we need that. So we need to have a way to understand and embrace that without being trapped by it in ways that also we can see, where there's all kinds of ideas that I pointed out plenty in the past where people should figure out that they're wrong, but they don't realize it, and they could just figure it out and they would be so much better off. Other people would be better off. So, but it can't just be by saying, oh, I'm going to use cold like logic and no emotion. These people just feel, but I'm going to think, right? We need a way to do both and understand when and how to do both together. And we need to know why, we need to know what I just explained as well. Like why you have to see why the opposite doesn't work, right? I'm constantly demonstrating the way to understand that things are correct and understand is I show you the opposite and show how it can't work, can't be. So what we want to do as we start to build this, you might start to notice on your own what's something close, at least, and then we'll continue so you can notice it more fully. And what I do with you, and one way of understanding what I do with you is I make things visible for you. Right? I can help you notice useful ideas, right? In this case, about strategy, meta strategy, and so forth. But I bring them in view, right? I paint a picture, I talk to you, and I give you contrast that you haven't necessarily seen before. And I'm able to do this for you because I do it myself, and I have a method for that. All right. So when is the only time feelings don't matter? Let's picture when we're plotting our course if we were sailing a ship. When do the currents not matter? When I'm trying to figure out which port to go to, then I don't necessarily have to look at the currents, right? I want to figure out what port I need to go to, or at least which potential ports. Maybe I don't have to go to one. Maybe there's just no way to get to one. But I want to figure out maybe that's even a secondary question, which port to go to. But why am I generally sailing the ship? What's going on, right? So there's a certain type of planning and thinking I want to do regardless of the current. And then I take the currents into account. That's not a perfect metaphor, but it starts to give an indication. So the time that feelings don't matter is what we need to have a space for figuring out, oh, here's a quick thing we want to notice. Do our feelings about what's true? And you might not even think it's a feeling, but your mind gives you a conclusion about what's correct. If I ask you, do you have parents? Are they alive? Do you have a child? You can answer that, but you feel the answer and you feel confident in it. You can see a picture or see something, but you mostly just get a conclusion and feel that it's right. And there's a way that we can't just throw that out, right? We can't say ignore your feeling that your parents exist, your memory, and so forth. Your memories are there. However, and our feelings guide us, feelings about what's true guide us correctly. However, they also guide us wrong. There's mistakes in there too. And we can certainly see it in other people as well. And sometimes our feelings don't give us options that we wish that we had realized. So they might give us a wrong conclusion, or there might be something we wish we had noticed, but we didn't have a feeling about it when we wished we had. So our feelings aren't infallible, and we want to make our default feelings more accurate. Then, if our feelings are fundamentally guiding us, including, when I say feelings again, the conclusions that we have constantly, our default decisions, everything we feel like doing, the options that occur to us, that's all ultimately what I mean by feelings or default. What we see. So I said what we see and feel. If we combine what we see, including in our mind, as options, plus our motivation for doing it, our feelings, what we notice, you put that together, and we see that it's not totally flawed, and it would be, to try to throw it all out would mean being totally still, having no motivation, and just basically wasting away and dying, which is absurd. So we can't throw it all out, but it doesn't guide us perfectly. And trying to ignore it every minute, which is similar to trying to throw it out, but a little different. Feeling the idea that we would just know what's correct, but feel like doing something else all the time, that's incredibly tedious and basically not going to work, right? If you, on the one hand, we know this, right? Like if you, on the one hand, want to lose weight or exercise or work on something and you totally don't feel like doing it day after day, and then that if we just stipulate that wouldn't change, in many cases it changes by doing stuff. But if that doesn't change, then you're just going to probably give up, right? In many cases. And at some point you will. Like even cases where you supposedly don't, it's where you go for a month and then finally the habit changes, right? And the feelings change over time. Plus, it would just be a very unpleasant life to feel all the wrong things about what's helpful to do, to be motivated about the wrong things, to not be motivated about the things you want to be, right? So we don't just want to have an intellectual sense of what we want and have our feelings not match up to that, right? That would just suck all the time and we'd have internal conflict, cognitive dissonance, whatever you want to call it. So what we want to do then is we realize, first of all, that whatever our current level of understanding is, whatever is right and wrong right now in our brain, that's pretty much what's going to be our default, which is pretty much going to dictate what we do. Even if you feel like with willpower and decision-making, you overcome your default to some degree, it's only to some degree, right? You don't just get fully outside of what you feel like and notice and think about it to be possible day after day. So even if you maneuver within that to some degree properly, then it dictates. What we want to do is have some space, however, that's quarantined or separate, where those don't guide it, that aren't dictated by our feelings, where we can think about things in a way, but then understand that that's just going to be a foothold. And let's say I, through some method, decide that I want to only eat a certain amount of calories, then I wouldn't want to change my mind. If I somehow, I'm not saying that's even figure outable, but suppose we were to figure something like that out through some method where it's like intellectual and proper and using reason correctly, just to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Then if the next day we still felt like eating more calories, then we would want that space to be safe when we figured out the number of calories. Even no matter what we felt, we don't want to then say, oh, I feel differently and have that change. We wouldn't want to feel like it failed. We would want it to somehow still be its own thing that's working for us. And so we would need to keep it separate in some way from the rest of our world that needs to involve feelings and what we naturally notice in our conclusions and so forth. So what we're going to want to do is understand that our current beliefs, feelings, what we notice, conclusions, what we see, what we feel, is true and so forth. We often don't put the phrase, it is true that, in front of stuff. Like if I said, how many kids do you have or how many are your parents alive? You wouldn't say, it is true that my parents are both alive. You would just say, my parents are alive and my parents aren't. One of them passed away. But you don't say the phrase, it is true that, but you can notice, if you remember this, as you in the future, right after this webinar, you can notice that you grammatically or logically could put the phrase, it is true that, in front of statement after statement that you make in your head, that you act on, or that you say to someone else constantly, right? We just leave it off, but we're making statements up like truth. Like we're making assertions about truth constantly, like truth statements. Just being a bit aware of that is helpful conceptually for various reasons. So notice that. Just if you're aware of it in the background, you don't have to constantly be thinking about it, but I want you to just generally realize that you're making these truth assertions constantly. So those are going on. And what we want to do, though, is have a way that we can think about ideas and we can come to conclusions that's done in a way that's not guided by our previous beliefs, what we previously saw, what we feel like is true, which obviously comes from culture, all kinds of stuff, right? We want to have something. Can we do that? Is the question. Is that possible? That's actually possible. It's not possible to instantly feel like it's all true just because we come up with it properly. So when people confuse those, that's when they basically stay confused, is if they think that, so what people do, they'll, let's say they start learning from me. Right? They're just introduced. They start learning law of implication stuff. Until they encountered me, they might have mostly, without even realizing it, like a fish in water, to see if something's true, they check a certain place in their mind, and it almost feels physical, right? You do like a truth check, right? If I ask you a series of questions, true or false, there's a place that you would check, and maybe a little bit of a method. Maybe you'd see if you feel a certain way about it, then you would look for a justification. If you could see like a memory or something that elaborates the feeling, right? Again, the same example, are your parents alive, right? I apologize for that example if that caused anyone to develop memories. Almost every example I come up with has a potential problem, but at least it's something. When we ask that, people will have a strategy, like a mental strategy. This is a little bit like it touches on neurolinguistic programming, but knowledge of that is not relevant. And even whether this officially is exactly NLP or not, it's not really relevant. But if it seems a little bit familiar to that for those of you, then it's a little bit like that, where you'll have a strategy for feeling like something is true and feeling like confident and certain. And you would go through it, right? How do you spell fish, right? So you might like feel it. And if I said, do you spell fish, F-I-S-H, then you might go in and picture it and feel if it feels right. So there's that strategy. And as I said, like a fish in water, people assume that's the only possible strategy. And so when they hear me talk about how to know what's true, then they feel like if I lead them to a conclusion through the right method, just to overly simplify, like logically, if I say reasonably and logically, then they'll feel confused because they'll do that check, and that check won't resonate with that check yet. You see this a little bit like where some people who are theistic, who believe in God, they might say that it's like a gift of faith, or like where you feel like it's true that God exists. And then they'll talk to people that don't believe that God exists and, oh, you don't have that gift yet. Like you need to try to have that gift, right? Like they'll feel like it's something some people have and some people don't. Now, in terms of like neuroassociation, where you can do that check and feel that it's true that God exists, just like it's true that you have parents, whereas some people do that check and they don't feel it, that's, again, a neuroassociation. It's basically biological based on experiences, thought, whatever. Not the actual truth of that is not biological, but the feeling is triggered biologically, right? Something parallel to biology, right? Whether or not it's physical, it doesn't matter. It's still this check that's undergone. But that check isn't actually fully accurate. That check is just our default approximation, or our brain giving us a fabricated sense of confidence. It's a substitute for figuring things out properly. However, there's that Zen koan, the Zen saying, where it's like before enlightenment, gathering water, chopping wood. I might be phrasing a little bit wrong, but after enlightenment, gathering water, chopping wood, right? Before someone has a method, like a quarantine separate method that they can use to filter and figure out ideas correctly, to filter some ideas. That method does not make you omniscient. People want to use it on like these facts or that fact, use it on that. It's not exactly like that. I'll show you what it's like in a little while. But you have this quarantined method in place and understanding where you figure out some things that are correct or not. And then it does not mean that it will pass that check right away. It does the kinesthetic, the how do I feel about it? Do I see it? Do I see memories or corroboration or justification for it? But when we can what we need to do is understand that it isn't about it passing that check. That in order to have properly filtered and correctly known, understood knowledge of the right sort, it starts out not being something that you feel, see, and so forth. That you don't think that it's wrong because of that. If I make some statement about government and someone feels, wow, when I go to feel and check if that's right, it doesn't add up. No. But once you learn to expect that part of the method for understanding knowing what's true is to understand everything I'm saying here, where there's the default method. And then after you run it through a check, you want to get it into the default. You want to get it to where you feel and naturally see the world correctly, right? But that'll follow over time. And it might take a while. It depends on, we can learn strategies for getting something integrated into our mind, to our brain and mind, that intentionally that we want. Like it's equivalent, not exactly the same, but equivalent. And the subset of it is to like setting a habit, right? There's a method, psychological, biological, et cetera, methods for setting habit. And what do people run into trying to do it is they run into the default and feeling like maybe I don't really want to do it because my default is telling me I don't want it. But once we see the whole system, once we have a model for the system itself, again, the meta understanding will unblock us when people are caught. They get their cyclical trap that people are caught in. If I didn't explain this, is and we can see it in a simpler, more mundane way with setting new habits, or we can see it in a more deeper way with attaining new knowledge, realizing that knowledge is correct and having it change their beliefs, rather than having their beliefs pushed back and delete out the knowledge experience, the reason that they used. You probably had the experience where you used reason with someone, they seemed convinced of something, and then the next day it was like Groundhog's Day. Right? You've experienced that. What happens is they don't realize there's any way to really gain knowledge outside of the default method, which is there to keep you alive before you develop the proper way to filter and your immune system for ideas. And then afterwards, that system still functions and you want it, right? The idea isn't to go blank and have no feelings, no thoughts, nothing, and just be like a being of whatever, pure knowledge who feels nothing. Because then without feeling, there's no meaning, there's no goodness, there's no experience. We feel just the same, but we understand even more clearly. There's teachers that talk about feelings can follow action. The problem is the epistemology is missing. The fundamental epistemology is missing from people that generally teach that. And so the new habit that when people talk about setting new habits, right? Certainly people talk about that, success gurus and NLP teachers and so forth. The problem is that the figuring out what new habits to set, that process is just coming from the same garbage heap, or not full garbage heap. There's plenty of good stuff, but there's the garbage, right? As the new habit might be more helpful, but there's a whole bunch of potential things that someone needs to figure out that they're not going to figure out without the proper thinking method. Anyway, once you do figure out the right habits, the right thoughts, right beliefs, you need to understand that you're not going to feel it right away. You're not going to see it necessarily. You may or may not see it. You might see it partly. You might see it. You're probably not going to see it and feel it in an integrated way for some amount of time. And then you could explore it more. You could think about it more. You could apply it more. All the similar things that are going to affect habits over time. And then you'll see it afterwards. You'll feel it later. And now the only real problem with knowledge, but it's a full block for people, is that they don't know where to check. They'll do the old check to see if new knowledge gained properly is correct. Like they gain knowledge to reason, but they won't have a way for it to stick, right? It'll just get rejected because they'll just be operating only with the one system, or it'll go in the same system and they don't have a quarantine space. You need to have a new face in your mind, metaphorically speaking, that is protected from feelings pushing back on it. And it's simple. You just need to understand what I'm saying for that space to be created. You need to, because it's just a foothold. No matter how small it is, no matter how weak it is, if it's there, you're fine. You'll build from there. That's how everything works. If you want the whole thing at once, you typically aren't going to get it unless you're lucky. It's simple. But you will build a feeling of and a sense of what's correct. And it's interesting just comparing myself with myself. It's uncanny. These days, my feeling about what's right, it's so much more dead on than it used to be. And it tends to just really be dead on in general, at least in terms of practical experience, expecting the world to be a certain way and that happening, thinking that certain things will work or won't work. And there's plenty of times when I think, I don't know, right? That's part of the secret. And I don't know plenty of stuff. We could have a promotion that we're doing. And I know we try this, there's certain things I know about it that we should do. There's certain things I know we shouldn't do. And then in many cases, I don't know how it's going to turn out. But still, that's better than someone that is planning on planning. It could turn out this. So I don't mean that I know everything by any stretch. But when I think something's going to be right, when I think it's wrong, it's uncannily on target these days. And I'm not claiming perfection at all, but it's uncannily on target, especially comparing myself with myself. But also in a way where, like we talked about earlier, where top 10% or top 1% is pretty much like falling off a log if you're starting out on any kind of equal footing with other people. Or they might like with SEO, you're not going to start out on an equal footing if you're just starting out with it with other people that have been doing it, but you don't have any inherent disadvantages generally, and you have a massive advantage with OMG. So that within several months to a year, then you'll be top 1%, right? Top 10%, top 1%. I don't mean like day two, or if I'm playing a new video game on the computer that people have been playing for a year, then I'm not going to on day 2 or 3 be as good as them. But give me a few months, or depending on the game, a month, a week, a few months, whatever, then I'll be in the top 1% or whatever. Just predictably. And just by having a number of meta strategies in place, it's just going to happen every time because other people don't have those meta strategies. And then if we're all starting out fairly equally, then it's just inevitable, right? And that's why I don't say that the number one overall, because some people might just have some inherent advantages, but the overall pool generally isn't starting out with that much of an advantage in enough cases that pick something where that isn't, as I said, it's not the case where they have some huge advantage. Okay, so when is the only time default? Doesn't matter. That's just a twist on the question of when the feelings don't matter. Default doesn't matter. The currents don't matter when you're thinking about what you want default to be. You might say, well, David, do you mean what I want the currents to be? The default doesn't matter when you're trying to figure out where you want to take your ship, right? And then you want to try to get as many factors or enough factors on your side, sailing your ship where you want it to go so that it gets to where you're trying to get to. It's right, a threshold, right? You need to get it to the port that you're trying to sail it to or whatever. But when you're figuring out how you want things to be, then you don't think about how they are. You think about how they should be. And what I just said is in practice, it might not be intellectually counterintuitive, but if you look at how people think and act and plan, it's counterintuitive. People constantly, they are taking a look at like how they think things are, where they think they're starting and all that to try to figure out where they should be. And that doesn't make any sense. If you're trying to figure out what port you want to bring your cargo to sell it, then you want to think about what port is going to be safe and where they're going to pay the most money. You're going to be able to sell, right? You're going to be able to communicate, whatever, right? Things that'll think that way, right? Things that are going to be conducive to you accomplishing your goal. If you're trading on a merchant vessel, then you want a port, right, that's safe where you can communicate. There's a place where you're going to be able to sell and at a good price. You don't really think about where you're at right now. You want to figure out where that is. Now, if you have to take into account the cost of the journey, then you can go do that next. And in terms of picking the actual port, I'm looking at this example, I just kind of kept it on the fly. In terms of picking the actual port, yeah, you might do that relative to the cost of getting there based on where you are. But before you think about which port, you're still thinking about something different that doesn't involve default of doesn't matter where you are. You want to think about the characteristic of the port that you want to get to. And for that, it doesn't matter where you are. You just want to think about where you should get to, right? Then you can take into, then in terms of choosing the actual place that you go, you might take into account how far you're going to be sailing, right? And the currents and so forth. But the characteristics of where you want to get to are, you don't want to think about the default. Another example that comes to mind is we'll see how this applies, but if you're looking to sell a stock, you're looking at market conditions and where you think the conditions are going to go, or factors in your life where you might need the money to pay for college, or you might not want to take a risk anymore. Like I didn't want to be in stock because I didn't want the money I was counting on for retirement to be in something that volatile. If it's money I can play with, that's different, right? Then the expected return is higher with stocks. But if I need to be sure, then bonds. But I look at those reasons, not what I purchased the stock at, right? Because that's famously the wrong place to look for that type of thing. People have figured that out. If you want to figure out how much money you want to make, or even the characteristics of a career that you want to have, then you don't really need to look at looking at like how things are right now is going to actually get in the way of that. You then look at how things are now to figure out how to get there. But the characteristics of the place you want to get to and make what I'm saying correct. There's an interpretation of what I'm saying that's correct. There's perhaps a right? If you misinterpret what I'm saying as figure out which port you want to go to, that you might base on alternative use and stuff relating to the reality on the ground. If you're figuring out what specific career to go after or which path to take in OMG, then then it's relevant to think about where you're at right now. But separately, when you think, or which person specifically to date, right, you might have to look at the reality on the ground. But when you think about what characteristics you want in a relationship and therefore a person or whatever, then there's a certain type of thing that you don't want to be looking at default for. And you want to learn to recognize that it's critically important for your whole process of thinking, planning, and everything that comes before the rest of what you get in life, right? It's an absolutely critical part of life to be able to have this quarantine thing that you can look at and work with conceptually and understand how that relates to default. First, that it's quarantine, but then you integrate them. You integrate them while keeping it, like you keep it safe, and then you, just like a new habit, right? If there's a new habit that you want to make, eating a certain amount of calories, trying to talk to a certain number of prospects, getting out once a week to a networking event, right? Let's say getting out once a week to a networking event. Suppose you decide based on reason, I'm going to decide that I'm going to try that. I'm going to try making it a habit. So in other words, I'm going to make it a habit. And then I'm going to, after I let it ride for 6 months, and see if you want to adjust things. But it might be a completely reasonable guess that you then stipulate that you want to make that a habit for getting out there and meeting people in a kind of a potential business that can lead to business contacts. Have you considered, by the way, guys, that in addition to the other benefits of a hobby, and I might have mentioned this briefly, but that it's such a great way to make business contacts is through your hobby, potentially. That's how I met Mike, was through my hobby of playing games, through Magic. Other people, it's people, their hobby can be church, and so they meet people through that, right? Or it's one of their hobbies. I don't you have to have the hobby, right? Your hobby is such an easy way to, probably one of the things in the background of people that have problems is they don't realize to parlay their hobby into business. That's where you can reliably get business, is through a hobby. You have so much more in common. The language, you relate so differently automatically in us with the people. It's just night and day. So it's yet another reason. Hobbies just create such a structure and a framework for your life. Everything else can weirdly fall into place around your hobby. Anyway, so I was illustrating the idea of how to integrate between the quarantined area where we can use reason and so forth, and then your feelings, default, and such. So you can come up with this idea that you want to install this new habit. But before you install the habit, it's not a habit yet, right? You're thinking what you want to make default. So obviously, there's a way that idea, networking in some way once a week. And maybe it's going out and just having a hobby. So you enjoy yourself and then you network, and you don't have to pounce on the people for business day one, but you're just getting to know people and they can refer you to people. Again, having that hobby is amazing. But even if it's just a hobby, so you just go out, hey, I'm going to make a habit, right, of that. And then you might realize one way to help make it easy to make it a habit is through the hobby. And that's part of the strategy of integrating, making something a habit is you think, how do I create conditions that'll make it a habit? Of course, one of those conditions is just to start doing it, right? But you can add vectors to that and make it easier and nicer. Either conceptually where you think about how it might be nicer, or you take somebody with you if you have that in your life that could make it more pleasant for you and feel more natural. You go with someone. In other cases, I'm just giving examples of stuff that can help you with your habit. You don't have to stop by going to the most uncomfortable type of meeting for yourself. You can go to something that's particularly comfortable, and then it becomes a habit, and then you can build up from there. Now you have a new habit of getting out and meeting and talking to people in a comfortable setting, and then it might be easier to do it in another setting. Semi-soft block, right? A sub goal that if you could achieve the harder thing of going out to a more difficult getting networking, then at least you can go to a more easy potential place or group. So there's a way in which the world and your experiences and your current habits and your results you get when you try to do the habit doesn't affect this quarantined idea that you want to set this habit. That, if you look at it properly, if you represent it properly in your mind, if you understand it properly, it doesn't get affected by results. It doesn't get affected by your current habit. It doesn't matter what reality looks like. You know that you want to install this habit. Even if you're eyeballing that you think it would be a good idea and you're going to try it for 6 months, you stipulate. Once you stipulate, you know it within that stipulation. And you can know that it's not ridiculous, right? And you can know that it looks right. What are you going to, and then you can prove it that way. Are you going to do what seems, all else being equal, are you going to do what clearly seems right in terms of helping you to get clients, which is do you think getting to know more people is going to help, right? Even just getting more comfortable talking to people, right? New people. Do you think that'll help you get clients or not, right? Pretty obviously, it looks like it'll help you. Whether it actually will, you can't know for certain, but it certainly looks like, right? And what are you going to do in life? Walk into a tree, or are you going to walk around a tree? Like, it looks like there's a tree there. What are you going to do? You're going to act on that? Or so yeah, we filter things, but when you look, when I show you ways to do a check and to filter it out, that's not going to get filtered out, right? The idea that, hey, let's try making it a habit to meet people in a comfortable setting, right? When you look at the opposite, what if I don't meet people? No, that doesn't make sense, right? If you look, will it help? Yeah, it's reasonable. Is it reasonable? Is it going to hurt me? Is there any major pitfalls? No, right? So it's going to end up passing all the checks, and then it looks right. And great. Now you actually can know that it's right, because if it looks right and you checked it, what are you going to do? As I said, what looks right or what doesn't, right? We are always going to default to what looks right. We're going to do what looks right. But maybe it looks right conceptually, but it doesn't feel like you want to do it. That's okay. You stipulate it. It looks right. It's quarantined there. It's not affected by the world. And isn't that correct? Don't you need that? Isn't everything I'm illustrating here, doesn't it itself pass at least a reasonable check, right? Do you want this potential budding new foothold to get hurt or affected by feedback or the world or your existing habits? If you have a new habit that you want to make, do you want the likelihood of installing it to be affected by whether or not you already have that habit that you want to have in the future? Of course you don't have it because you want to have it, right? It's a new habit. So obviously it shouldn't be affected by how things are already, right? Because it's a new thing. It, by definition, by logic, is not what's already there. So when you embrace and realize, of course it's going to feel odd at first, but the feeling that it's odd, the feeling like maybe it's not right, that is not going to give me, that's not where I look. That I know is false. So by default, I follow how things look and feel. We have to, as I said. All right, that's not wrong. But if it conflicts with this quarantined thing, this place that we use reason to, that is what I ignore. So if I'm walking into a tree, what looks like a tree, but I know that someone showed me how they're creating an illusion of a tree with a hologram machine, and they show me how it works, and I know that, then I know to ignore that. And I do walk, if that's part of the exercise or the experiment, right? Or if I'm learning to trust and I'm falling back and someone's catching me. The point of the exercise is you feel like not falling back, and then you do it anyway and you see something, right? So what we do is we have a clear exception to, right? And what if we had no exception? What if we never could ignore our feelings? What if we couldn't have a quarantined area of something that we could figure out through reason, or a new habit, right? As our kind of smaller example of the greater concept is the idea of a habit. I'm not only talking about habits. I'm talking about beliefs or other types of knowledge about the world, right? Knowing that God exists is not a habit. it's a belief or idea about the world, but for many people, it won't feel true. For other people, it'll feel right. But even then it's wrong because they're doing their usual check, and either group would screw it up. Either an existing theist, why do I need reason to know that God exists? Because I just do a check like I usually do, and it comes up positive. So why would I need reason? You need reason because you want to filter all your major beliefs through this quarantine system at some point and through a method that I'll elaborate on to check it, right? That's the nature of major beliefs. And you don't know it. What you want to start to understand is that you don't need to anymore have this idea that you, in this perfect way, anything that just by default you do the feeling neurolinguistic check. Does it feel right? Do I see it, that it looks right? Right? The same way as if I ask you, as I said, if your parents exist, or how many parents you have, or if they're alive, not think that. You do a certain check. That check, as you understand what I'm saying, you'll no longer need it in the same way. You will use it constantly. You'll act on it constantly, but it won't be where you look for a certain type of this quarantine knowledge ever anymore. Because when you have this new type of foothold, this new type of knowledge that's checked properly, then you don't need the fool's gold anymore. You don't need, you see, the way that I deal with the default type of knowledge, I'm not just paralyzed, oh, I know nothing, I don't think no, I realize I'm going to act on what I feel like is correct, but that I don't know anyway. And you embrace that. I have to. What's the opposite? That I just do what feels wrong every minute? It feels wrong right now to just start saying random words. So should I do it? No, you can't do what feels wrong all the time. Most everything is going to feel wrong in any situation. You can't act on all those things. So again, I look at the opposite. I can't go against what looks right and what feels right all the time. You go with what feels right. But you don't know it. You know it in this special new quarantine way. There's a special privileged beliefs and method where you have real knowledge, and you don't need to convince yourself anymore that you have knowledge in the default way. Instead, you understand, I'm going to act on the default. A belief isn't something that you know to be true. It has nothing to do with truth. A belief is something you act on, period. It's literal nonsense to say, I believe that such and such is true. That when you understand what I'm saying, and therefore when you understand how thought and correctness and clear thinking works, you would reject the phrase, I believe something to be true. I believe that God exists to be true. I believe that I can make $10,000. I believe that's true. I believe I can make $10,000 a month. And I believe I can make $3 million. I believe that it is true that I can make $3 million. You would reject that, weirdly enough. Now, I phrase, it is possible that I can make $3 million. That's reasonable. That's fun. But what I'm saying is beliefs literally and only are what you act on. You believe it if you would or do act on it. If you would act on it if the situation came up, then you believe it. You might not know whether you believe it until the situation comes up, but you believe it. However you'd act, that's how you believe. Beliefs literally are what you act on. They're not, you don't need to associate them with truth anymore. And as a matter of fact, you can understand that you can know what's true. Sometimes you don't know something, gray. Sometimes you know something, sometimes you know something's wrong, which is, that is something's wrong. But if you don't know, you don't know. It's correct. You don't need to turn gray into white or black anymore. You embrace the gray and understand, okay, within the gray, something looks like the best bet still, or I'm going to operate again. I'll find out what I believe, seeing how I act or how it looks or whatever. Or I just find out by thinking about it. Oh, I believe this, right? This is how I would act. And you might say, David, can I say, I think it's true? Again, you don't need to, this is about being the word police. I'm not telling you how to talk. I just want you to get the right concepts. Doesn't matter what you say. I say things that are a little bit nonsensical sometimes because our language doesn't really allow for much else. You have to say something. So you can catch me saying the wrong thing sometimes myself. But what I just want you to understand the truth of the phrase, if you don't know, that means you don't know for certain in clarity, whatever. Something can look a certain way. You can feel certain. You can believe something to a great degree, a lesser degree. It can look like the only option. It can look totally right. And then you act on it. And you don't have to try to act on it. Literally, you automatically will act on it. And that's why the distinction between you and your brain will end up being critical. That having this idea of you and then your mind and your brain is built to operate in the gray, like I referred to before, and you embrace that. It's a little bit metaphorical to people. I'm not a martial artist or swords person. I don't do sword fighting or anything myself. But there's a principle of things like that where you want to be able to, they say, get out of your own way, right? They practice enough where it's second nature, then they learn to let go. If you can let go of fear, if you can literally even embrace death, where you're okay with dying, then those people become the best swordsmen because there's a way that they stop consciously interfering with, there's no way to use the conscious process of gaining knowledge in the middle of a sword fight. And so you can actually only interfere with your body and brain doing their default without any conscious interference. So there's the Zen state of embracing death and not interfering, getting out of one's own way. And the same thing applies to more mundane things in life. It's easy to see with the sword. At least I think it's easy to see with this idea of sword fighting. So someone who practices, makes it second nature, gets practice getting like in the zone, not aware of self, right? Not aware of time, embracing death in a way where they're not trying to die, but they're not consciously trying to think about where their hand should go. And then the sword person would fight and act better. And that's true. That actually, it's correct. That's the way to sword fight, even though I don't know about sword fighting, but I know what I know about what I said. When you understand the model of how the mind works and how things work consciously, then you really do want to be able to get out of your own way, get in the zone where you're not aware of self. You're not consciously checking over things. And even if you're not fully in the zone where you're like this great Zen swords master, there's a mundane application where you're not like second guessing yourself constantly when you don't need to. Your brain is basically better than you in the gray, right? In a certain way, your default works. And this is why people say, oh, your first impression is the best. They're constantly discovering when this is the case. But the problem is they'll generalize it and say that this is how life should be. That's totally false. Okay. So the fact that your brain is good in a certain arena and that we want to learn how to set up our brain and mind properly and then get out of the way, that's true. But it is definitely not the case the way that they make the mistake in saying that's the secret to life. That's half the secret. The other half is how to consciously set yourself up. Another mistake people make is what I referred to earlier, that you want to be consciously aware, more conscious, more aware, notice more. That's not true either, right? It's like saying who should do more with let's say, just narrow it down to myself and Cotton in OMG, just to make it, okay, obviously there's 8 people in OMG, but just as a simple illustration, should I interfere more or less with Cotton? What I should do is what I'm good at is I set him up the way that I do, right? And then I let go. And if I were to micromanage and interfere and piss him off, not or anyone, but anyone, if you nitpick at them, it would interfere with them, right? I could pick any person that I work with, where I understand it actually is parallel in how our business works. It parallels in a good way and in a way that's a somewhat rare understanding, although in practice, other people understand this in a kind of a mundane way, is that I set them up in the way that I do, and then I let go. I don't watch over their shoulder. Sometimes I might tune into a webinar in a way that helps me set them up better, but not to micromanage and interfere with what they're doing. And this is the general question of micromanagement, right? Is do you do it or not? What you want to do is get a sense of how to set up whatever it is you're micromanaging, including your own brain. And the purpose of management, though, is the ideal is then you're compensating for what they're not good at or not doing, right? Setting them up in various ways so that then you can not interfere with what they are. And that doesn't get blocked through the micromanagement. I don't necessarily do that perfectly in OMG, but I pay attention to doing it. And it's pretty clear, it's within reason, just eyeballing it, that I'm relatively good at, for whatever that's worth. But at least if I'm teaching about it, I guess it's relevant if I'm relatively good at it. But again, it's the top 10% thing is really what for example, the top 10%. I'm probably in the top 10% of management type people, that I'm a management type person in terms of setting people up and then not micromanaging them over where I should. Even with OMG members, there's a certain parallel there where I want to make sure you're set up for success, but not treated like a person who can't succeed. There's a certain way that that if you're baby too much, it actually interferes with you. So I try to create those conditions too, to the extent that I'm able to. I can't, as I said, I don't micromanage everything to do that. But all these illustrations point to the fundamental relationship between you and your own mind. And so if you believe that what you want is control over your mind, and to the extent that you imply to other people, which we often do, that they control their mind, like, why did you do this? Or they did it because they don't have full control. It's the same thing as asking me why OMG does such and such if I didn't do it. There may have been something I could do to set it up better, but then there's a certain way that other people have to do what they're going to do. And I don't set things up perfectly, and they're not going to do everything perfectly either, right? They're operating with their own minds in a gray area. They don't know everything to say in advance, everything that's perfect. Neither do I. What we try to do is what I try to do, and what I'm telling you overall, is the more quarantined, correct strategies and beliefs and things you figure out that are safe and true and checked properly, then that's the way you maximize life. Because your brain isn't you. What you want to do, just like cotton isn't me, just to make it thick, right? Or whoever isn't me. I'm not comparing, of course, cotton to my brain. But there is the one parallel. Oh, it would be the same way in reverse with cotton and me, right? So it isn't like cotton's my brain and not me. It works in both ways with another person. He could look at himself as setting me up for me to do what I do well, right? And in either case, he doesn't control me directly, but he can control something about how he sets things up and how he interacts with me, right? So with a person, it's reciprocal, where from either person's point of view, the other person's out of your control directly, but you can set them up better or worse, right? In a relationship, in a business venture, in a client and consulting thing, right? You set them up better or worse, and then they do what they're going to do. And there's a way that you have to embrace that. And micromanaging past that is unhelpful. So what you don't want to be doing is feeling like you need to struggle constantly with your brain in a way that's counterproductive. Once I'm setting you up in this way, once I describe it in this way, you can start to notice what the difference might be. No matter how great I explain it in the moment, I think you can almost start to fill it in for yourself. What you want to do is make the default better, right? Like your brain is going to do whatever it does based on its current level, based on the current level of correctness and knowledge, both knowledge of things that might be helpful, plus whatever whatever wrong idea. So the more useful ideas your mind has, plus whatever incorrect ideas it has, it's going to, right, like knowledge plus mistake. Some people, they only realize that they can increase their knowledge, like they just want more information. But you also need to get rid of wrong ideas, but both are helpful, right? More good ideas is helpful too. But what you want to do is be affecting default and realize your brain's always going to act on the default, whether or not you try to fight it. So the only battle worth fighting with your brain, so to speak, or the only way that you can really help it is to work on default. And the way you do that is the next thing we'll talk about is you want to have, but it all matters that you realize how to use and the importance of and what you're going to do with this quarantined place where you're going to use reason in a certain way to get knowledge and what it's supposed to feel like, which is it's not supposed to feel like anything. You don't use feeling or sight to check it. And that's the fundamental block, because when people think that's what they need to do, they need to feel or look a certain way when you have correct, checked, properly built knowledge. So what you want to do is build this proper knowledge. And then just by building it, it's going to impact default. But then you can look at part of the knowledge that you can build is how to increase the efficiency or the effectiveness of having this quarantined special area that's not subject to default and feelings and so forth, that's built properly, how it can affect your beliefs, what you act on, your feelings, what you feel, what you notice, right? Everything. And which means that another thing that you want to understand better is default. What's the nature of this default? What's the nature of my beliefs? And so, right. So this meta becomes relevant. Obviously, there's meta understanding. So some of the very first things that we quarantine, which I'm literally doing with you right now, or at least get you started with it, quarantining it, is understanding the meta of it itself, the structure of how you and your mind interact and how thought works and habits work and beliefs and all that, how they alter. What's one system that we want to master an understanding of? I wrote, when do we not need to be realistic about our goal? right? It's the same type of question as when's the only time feelings don't matter, when's the only time default doesn't matter. We're not realistic about goals. We're figuring out the ideal, right? Ideally, what do we want? And then we can think, what's the semi-soft block? What's realistic? What's a realistic thing that if I really focus in on it, if I could achieve my ideal, then what's a step along the way, advantage or a building block or an achievement along the way that will, if I'm competent, it'll really help me or even assure that or virtually assure that I'll reach my ideal. Or maybe I don't know if I can achieve my ideal. But again, you don't need to worry about that when you think about realistic. But by knowing the ideal, you can think about, okay, maybe I don't know if it's realistic or it seems unrealistic to achieve an ideal, but what would be something along the way that would be that the ideal helps me to figure out, right? Maybe you ideally want $1 billion, but regardless of whether you can make $1 billion or not, then you could, and then you might think, how is $1 billion an ideal? That's a misunderstanding of ideal anyway. An ideal, you can never max out, like money can never be maxed out, right? You can never have a maximum amount of money. So an ideal, generally it's something that can be maxed. And so what you want to do is, what would I want to do with the money? What would make sure to get me over the threshold with what I might need money for? That would be your ideal situation, right? Maybe it's where, and then you check it as I'm going to show you. If you think, some people accidentally think with money, I want to be able to buy anything that I want. But if you check that, it's not possible, right? What if you want a spaceship? What if you want to make everyone do what you want all the time? You can't pay all the world enough money to do that, right? You'll never be able to buy all that you could theoretically want. So then you might need to start defining what it is again, what is the ideal then? The ideal, we can't reach to buy anything you want. Never have to worry about money in that way. Instead, you might come up with something where you're not really afraid when it comes to money. The ideal would be if you had a sense of what your needs would be and like what maybe basic comfort might look like, how much that would cost, build in a little bit of a buffer to that, and then be able to make alternative use decisions on making money after that based on a good that you might want, and then decide whether you want to go earn the money for it. Maybe that would be an ideal. It seems, at least that's more reasonable than a lot of what other people come up with, and then maybe you hone it out from there. Or maybe that's it. Maybe that's perfect. Who knows? I haven't gone past that's where I'm at right now. Okay. I know I've been talking for a while. Let me give an indication of how I check over these ideas, how I use reason. I don't know. There's not too many building blocks, but some of them might open up a bit of a can of worms. Trying to think. I want to go a little bit to some discussion as well. Why don't we try doing this? Let me try just describing again what I keep doing, which is when you spot an important premise, right? You're thinking about money, then what's the ideal regarding money, right? So when you'll come up with a statement like, okay, and I gave you an example of one, which is I want to be able to buy whatever I want. That's what a lot of people come up with, but without thinking, right? And how do they do that? Notice they can't buy something and they wish they could. And they're like, man, one day I'll be able to buy whatever I want, right? But if they checked over that, then using the simple check, so this top 10% of anything thing, there's a simple check that people just don't do in almost every case, that if you do, you'll eliminate so many errors that you'll just skyrocket to near the top in most cases. And then again, that simple check is equivalent to when you come up with something like, all right, I want to buy whatever I want. Then if that checks out. Another example, when people have an issue with someone who's LGBTQ, right? Lesbian, gay, queer, transgender, bisexual, then any justification I've heard for even judging that a person's a little bit wrong, right? Of course, I'm not even going to caricature as like hating such and such a person, but there's people that might say, oh, I'm fine with whatever someone wants to do, but they feel like it's a little bit wrong. Another way to illustrate it is they don't feel like it's the exact same thing as being left-handed or having red hair, right? It wasn't until my 40s. I was into my 40s at some point when I think Jason, who's on here, mentioned the idea if he was making a website about the idea, like reacting to the idea of, or in a positive way about the word ginger. And that's actually a pejorative. And I apologize if it's even bothers anyone for me to say it, but it's so foreign to me that it's hard for me to feel it. But if someone ever told me that was offensive, I wouldn't. But that word apparently is even a pejorative, or in some place in the world, and sometimes I had never even heard. I literally was over 40 And I'd never even heard of the concept of someone being thought pejoratively for having red hair, but apparently it exists. Some people have a thing against people with red hair. There's even a word that the word ginger can be used in a pejorative sense or with an intonation that's nasty or something. Apparently, no, apparently in the sense of it clearly seems that it's some places and sometimes with some people that's the case. But if you're anything like me, that seems crazy, right? If being LGBTQ feels any different than how crazy than like red hair, which again should be literally 0% crazy. But sorry, the point is I can't imagine there being even 0.0001% issue with someone having red hair or being left-handed, right? But in history, same thing with being left-handed. It was looked at as literally immoral or wrong in some way or something to be trained out of, right? Both of those things probably, if you're anything cultural like me, red hair and being left-handed, it's ridiculous. It's incredible to imagine that there would even be the set. You wouldn't even say, "Oh, I accept people that have left hand, either left-handed." People with left-handed, I don't. I love them too. Wouldn't say something like that because it'd be weird to say something like that. Like, why would I have to say I love them too or it's okay? Of course, it's freaking. So if someone feels, and now that's how I'm drawing I'm using that to help you notice or have a shared explanation of noticing if it's anything but that with someone being LGBT, then there must be some like justification for that, right? The minute it gets anything but no difference whatsoever. No, zero. By the way, in terms of like public displays of affection, I don't tend to like to see it with, I don't think it's immoral per se, but we don't put it in people's face with heterosexual either. So in that case, it's exactly identical to have like extreme significant public displays of affection. There could be, at least that would be a reason why, at least it would be consistent, right? Or anyway, but I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but at least it can be consistent if someone doesn't want to see it with heterosexual, so it wouldn't be particular to something else. But if it's in any way immoral or something that would be ideal to change or something like that, then why? And the reason I bring this up is doing the chat. I'm just using this as an example. That's probably neutral for people. Probably people don't have strong feelings about this in most cases. But it's interesting because it's ripped off today's headlines a little bit. It's a little bit apropos current, but still, I'm probably not too emotional. But every justification for it being even a little bit wrong falls apart if you just check it. So one of the famous ones might be just, is it natural? But so now how do we check that premise? If we're using it as a premise, if something not being natural makes something wrong, then for something to be a premise, it has to always hold. If it doesn't, you might say, was that extreme, David? No. If a premise doesn't always hold, it can't support anything, right? If I said, for example, that being gay is a little bit wrong because some people are bad, right? And therefore some people are gay. So like the premise, or if I said people are bad, therefore gay people are bad, then you'd say, but David, let's say that in the sense of bad and that it's not true, right? That it's not just blanket truth. People are just inherently immoral and they're all wrong. So it can't be a premise. If it's not always true, it can't be a premise, right? Because if there's exceptions, I have to explain why this time it's not an exception. Hopefully that makes some sense. But you can play around with it. It's what I'm saying is certainly correct. That if something is going to be used as a premise to stand on, to make an argument from, it has to always hold. If there's any exceptions, then you would have had to explain why this is not one of those times. So there's a bazillion. The minute we do a check, just for a second, right, or a few seconds on, are there some things that aren't natural? Now we would ask, well, what's natural? Like what? And even natural things. How about cobra venom? Right? At least we don't want to get bit by it. We'd say it's not particularly good, or mosquitoes. Right? I'm not a fan of those. Right? So some natural things are bad. And then of course, just our things that are unnatural. Our houses are unnatural, right? They're man-made, right? Doesn't unnatural mean man-made or fabricated, right? So at least someone would have to come up with some definition of natural that we could even start discussing. They don't like mine, but I can't think of any. It's just this idea that natural things are okay. Like things that aren't natural are like immoral. Like how about someone colors their hair? Is that immoral? Right? That's not their natural hair color. So it's just on the face of it, you just think of a zillion examples instantly. It's not even close, right? And yet there's plenty, I'm not saying a majority, but plenty of people think literally based on that reason, I need that. Other people will be saying, well, marriage, or if you're talking about, in this case, marriage, which is not the same thing as saying whether it's moral. They're talking about marriage. They might say it's been an institution for 4,000 years. Slavery has been an institution for 4,000 years too, right, throughout the world. The draft has been all kinds of things have been institutionalized. Taxation is an institution. So the fact that something's an institution wouldn't be it either. What other justification? You just keep going with justification. right? Someone could say the Bible says that it's wrong. Paul says that it's wrong. So now Paul says that it's wrong. Is Paul God? Is Paul infallible? The statement that Paul is necessarily, everything that Paul wrote is necessarily infallible. And plus, we have to interpret what Paul wrote, right? And then there's so many people that, because of the condemnation, that this undertone of condemnation and judgment towards people in that group, or that identify in that group, or feel that way, or born that way, like they really, not all of them. I don't know. I'm not speaking for all of them, but it's definitely true that a lot of them hurt. I don't mean a majority or whatever, but there's so many examples of people that either did or wanted to commit suicide. I've heard from some myself that said, I've heard one person said that just Mike talking a little while, like years ago, about like how you're not your brain and stuff. You're just a suicidal person. It relates to, it's rooted in the judgment, nothing to do with being gay, but the judgment about it. There's just a way that you're, and so this is really hurts people. So it's a massive pain to the point of it basically kills people. I realize they can kill themselves, but there's a point where people in this mass judgment drives people, right? And this is all an example. I don't have a dog in the hunt on this. This isn't a real emotional topic for me, except if I think about people being hurt or killing themselves, that's a little bit emotional. But I'm not, this isn't like a major crusade of mine. But look at but it's nice. It's a good way for me to illustrate. I've used lots of other topics to illustrate just today. But people really hurt. It's like at some point when something predictably is going to lead hundreds or thousands of people to kill themselves, or a lot of others to feel like killing themselves, to do something that just makes someone feel like killing themselves, that's a major hurt, right? That's a major horrible thing. And you better have a great reason. And again, there wouldn't even be a reason, unless they were doing something horrible, like genuinely horrible, and you're pointing it out, and that made them want to kill themselves because of their own mistake, right? You don't want them to kill themselves for doing something horrible. You want them to realize what they're doing wrong and stop. I'm talking about property rights violations now. I'm not talking about being gay, of course, is not. As far as I've never heard an argument that's even 0.00001% wrong or whatever. It should be fully, utterly, completely fine in every way. Sorry, unless someone were to show me something, but I haven't seen it. Right. But by default, what is it? I go with what seems and what I can see now, which is massive suffering from it. Again, I don't mean the majority of people suffer from it, but thousands at least, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of people suffer to some degree of it. And some will go all the way to kill themselves. Many people feel suicidal or self-loathing because of what they were taught when they were young about how it's so bad. And then they learn that they are. And so it caused a lot of pain. And then the flimsiest justification. So Paul wrote, so where does that lead? We're gonna cause massive pain because of something that, again, that a person wrote, and then we interpret. I'm quite certain, as far as I'm aware, I can scour over the text again, but I'm not aware of anything. When I read supposed things, it's moronic. Jesus said something like avoid sexual immorality. I read one person making the argument, Jesus said avoid sexual immorality. And therefore, so they beg the question, right? They assume that being LGBTQ or some permutations of that or some instance of that is immoral. And then they say, you just said, don't be immoral. Pretty clear, at least the obvious thing that Jesus was referring to was just breaking your commitment to somebody. And then there was the famous incident where they were going to stone an adulteress, right? And Jesus said, you is without sin, throw the first stone. And Jesus said, they don't condemn you, I don't condemn you either. And that was that far cry for wanting the person to kill themselves, right? Or not wanting them, but driving them to suicide. How about the Old Testament? Again, there's all kinds of times when you're supposed to stone people and so forth, and that law that has been discarded. It just is just don't want to get into theology or whatever, but you're talking about your interpretation of a book. I'm not, even if it is a perfect word of God, then what? Then you interpret it perfectly, right? Like you don't, what does it even, again, what does it mean to check what that statement means? I'm just illustrating process now. I'm not trying to make a theological statement, but what does it mean for a book to be infallible? If you read it in a language that you don't speak, do you get infallible meaning from it? No, then you probably get no meaning from it. You can test it. So then what? So if it has to be in a language you speak, then the book itself does not impose perfect truth upon you, or else you wouldn't have to read it in your own language, right? So your brain interprets it. And then why would one, again, it's just trying to make certainty out of a gray. You couldn't, no matter, God could write a book, God's self, and you wouldn't get perfect truth from it, because by the time you interpret it through your own view of the world and limitations and stuff, there's just things people don't get. I have a hard time explaining my stuff, right? Imagine if God tried to write everything about how the world works in a book, and maybe God did. And I'm not really making a statement, but again, it would be limited by our own thing. And then just on the surface, all kinds of people that believe in the Bible or other books, but just take the Bible, they disagree about that. Peter and Paul had a major disagreement about theology. So how could that be if they were all like infallible all the time? It just doesn't add up from its own internal logic. So again, I'm not worked up about the topic. It's just, we don't need to, it's stuff like that is just symptoms of wanting to make certainty where there isn't. The simplest check, we could stop hurting people about that as a nation. I don't think many people in here do. I'm not talking, I'm illustrating my strategies here. I'm not trying to talk about a topic, right? Other than I just have to use different topics to illustrate. And remember previously before that, I talked about how much money, the idea with money, right? So there's a topic about that. It showed a simple check would show that, and then that would show that it's not about buying everything. Then, and even if someone wouldn't intellectually affirm that they want to buy everything, people get confused about money. What the mind does, it develops habit where it just wants to, like something that was good in a different setting, it still is associated with being good in a new setting. So conditions change, but our default belief is that it's still good, or good in the sense of a priority that we should invest resources in. Money is a classic example of that, or spending money is another example. Spending money, sometimes we spend money, is a cool example here. Sometimes we spend money and we get something and there's a nice payoff, right? And it was all worth it. And then we also might like the feeling of, oh, we can spend money, and you feel powerful. Oh, I wanted that, I could buy it. But then people start to make more money and they start to spend too much, right? Because the mind generalizes that, oh, spending money and being able to spend money is good. And then we can track another conclusion it comes to, which is if I'm competent, I can make money and spend it. It's almost like it would mean that I'm incompetent. If I can't afford something, I'm disappointed in myself. Again, there's the goal to like yourself, to keep up with your own standards. Or particularly, I won't like myself. If other people look at me and judge me like I'm not so awesome, then that's not good. Pay money to avoid that. But that starts to get really expensive. Or they'll look at me like I am awesome if I spend money and I buy stuff that helps them, or they just see me, either I buy it for myself and they're impressed by it, or I buy it for them, like a round of drinks, or throw money around, pay them a lot or something. And they treat me like I'm awesome, and then it gets addictive, and you act as if it's true, that just spending money is good. Of course, you wouldn't necessarily intellectually affirm that, but if you don't have an immune system, people will act on that belief, and way more than they should. And they don't really think of alternative use of resources. If someone were to spend money and you were to say, what else could you have spent that money on? If they don't have an immediate answer, then they obviously didn't think it through ahead of time. That proves it. So I want to start you out with, maybe we might do next time where I go even more like systematic. I'll remind you, I'll go over things like, these are terms of report, but consciousness field not matching. It talks more about how you're not your brain. The basic tools are understanding what I mean by consciousness field, understanding that concept, and then understanding about truth always involving one thing matching another. And then what you're always going to need to do really in practice is notice how things don't match. So that's going to be the basic method. And I've been doing it all along. I constantly do it. But I'm not going to go on and on about that right now. What I want you to do is just start to notice basic premises that you're acting on. And when you're thinking about something, it comes up. And then once you start doing that, then you realize this. I remember David talked about red flags. I'm going to start to need a meta strategy about when do I start to notice and how do I notice? How do I bring to view premises that I need to check? Right? But you'll ask that question and then that'll help you get the answer, and we can work on it together in the future. But you'll start to see the benefit to a meta way of doing things where you start to notice premises. So in order to check them in the first place, once you're able to check them and see the benefit of checking, then you want to notice what to check, right? So it starts to build on itself. And the critical trap to avoid is to feel like, and that's where people probably get trapped up with the proof of God. They're like, oh, they just assume without realizing it. Oh, I thought you were going to make me feel, I thought that God exists is now going to pass that check instantly of, yeah, it's true. Like it feels true. It looks true. I can't necessarily do that. And you can do that without actually proving it properly, right? Like you can make someone feel like God exists without actually going through the proper conscious field not matching, disproving the opposite, showing how the opposite has to be wrong. So you run it through a check, and if it's a premise, is it always true? Is there any instance where this premise is not true? Like with, oh, I want to be able to buy everything. Where did that lead? Or the idea that something's not natural, that it's wrong. Or because we interpret Paul as saying something that we should condemn people and drive them to suicide. Is that really, shouldn't that be a red flag? On why don't I just say I don't know? And because I like Paul writes something, is that again? How about just making that a gray area for yourself? Without, I'm not preaching. I'm trying to just give an example of how to treat it. Think about it intellectually. I know for sure I don't want to drive someone to suicide, right? By default, like in a vacuum. I don't want to drive them to feel like killing themselves. I don't want to make them miserable and loathe themselves. And I'm not absolutely positively not all people that identify that way do, but some it's easily traceable, right? Condemned by their culture, in some cases by whatever, by their parents, by pejoratives here and there. And then one way or the other, it happens for sure. So I know that for sure. And then counterbalanced against that, Paul wrote something. And then I check, is it possible that Paul could write something and it might possibly be wrong? Or what's the opposite? Do I know for sure that is it absurd that Paul could be wrong about? No, it's not absurd. Again, I disagree with Peter. Like, you don't start out with a person being infallible and have to prove why they're not, right? There needs to be some compelling reason, and there's just nothing that compelling about Paul, period. Jesus didn't even mention Paul, for those of you who are Christian. Like, it's just, you have to beg the quick start by assuming Paul's infallible to even start to wonder why the question even is relevant. Of course, I'm not going to treat him like he's infallible, like for me, and there's no reason to do it. Why? Because Paul wrote to Timothy that all scripture is profitable for reproof and correction. So in other words, that's interpreted as like everything written in the Bible is true. But Paul wrote that, right? Again, and Paul wasn't referring to his own letter when he wrote that, like presumably, right? And the things Paul hadn't written yet, like it's all just bizarre when you break it down. Like you could be a Christian, you could look to follow Jesus. I think that Jesus was God. I know for sure that God exists. Again, the opposite of God existing is your conscious field is created and changes for no reason. Nothing's doing. When you start to look at, could the universe be doing it? Sorry, it was a bank from the idea that the universe is doing it, it just peels away like an onion. There's nothing left there. It's nonsense. The idea that the universe could affect your conscious field directly, that it has the power. As soon as you turn the universe into something that could change what you're aware of, you're basically giving it the exact qualities that God would have. So you basically end up creating the idea of God and just calling it something different and then doing a switcheroo in your mind and deciding because your separate definition of the universe is that it's not conscious and it's a bunch of stuff. And people just do like a magic trick and switch things in their mind. It's called equivocation, which I can get into in the future. But if anyone, like basically that I met, if they talk through an issue with me, just in practice, and then take this out to a practical level here and applying it this week for yourself and everything. Anyone that I talk through an issue, talk through a problem, in practice and experience, I do this. I just check over their basic major things that they want, what they're like, where they'll end up by default relative to their ideal, and just check over basic. They'll just kind of talk about what they're doing, what they want. And if I do that with someone, then just this basic method of checking things over and for like premises and then what doesn't add up and helping them iron those things out of their thinking. Like again, in practical experience, like clockwork, they end up in a much better place where now their brain operating in the gray area is not going into a place that it's wrong and going to be stuck and can never find the answer, right? And so we have it looking in the right place, and they might not know the answer, but they've eliminated a whole bunch of wrong places and stuck places that they would be, and you're much better off. And again, you apply it to any niche. There's just if you hire an outsourcer, right? Just think about it practically again this way. There's just going to be 9 out of 10 of them are just going to do stuff that kind of obviously shouldn't be there if they were thinking about it, right? If they were just checking over, all right, what would the ideal outsourcer be like? And then I don't have to necessarily be the ideal because again, figuring out the ideal doesn't mean that you're going to get there from where you're at right away, right? But if you think about what the ideal person doing your profession would be like, right, client consulting or whatever, then that's going to so quickly narrow down what you actually do. Or as I was putting it a different way, if you think about what the ideal would be like, and then you take that ideal and you think, what's practical? What would like realistically now? First, I looked at the ideal that was necessary. Now I'm going to look at what's realistically you would expect like a person to do. And 9 out of 10 people that are actually doing it just aren't going to be doing that. In many cases, 99 out of 100 won't be doing it. People call it common sense, right? But it's just it's badly that phrase just badly misrepresents accurate thinking and how it works. It is a common ability. Everyone has it. Everyone has the ability to do this type of checking, quarantining, and so forth. And that way, it's common. It doesn't take a special talent or innate ability or genetic or a learning or anything. So in that way, it is in common with all of us. We can all do it. But then if you just actually do it by having the model that makes sense out of doing it, then it becomes more of a habit, and you're just going to rapidly just lead an easier life. And it can almost be very plausible that life, as I said, like you'll be really echoing what I say, where life just isn't that hard. Like there's a plenty of gray area in life. There's plenty of issues to deal with, but our brain can handle it if we just handle our part, like consciously, of checking over and getting rid of the obvious stuff. And the thing is, once you get rid of the big obvious stuff, it's going to reveal the next layer. Like more things will be noticed, I guarantee you. So you start with big obvious things and it'll build. Just like sometimes I wonder, wow, how did an author come up with this whole story? They didn't come up with it all at once, right? They started somewhere and the story sort of developed right from there. Kind of like you start writing and then the next thing starts to reveal itself. Or first you might write cliche stuff that isn't that good. And then you get to where there's even a phrase for that among creativity gurus called like writing down the bones or something. You start writing and first you write cliche stuff, but you start brainstorming. At first it's like the cliche, the usual stereotypical default template stuff. But then as you start to do it, you start to get that out, and then you start to get more traditionally creative or more new stuff. So the traps for using this and for using building what you can know to be true, there's a related trap. There's the one where people check in the wrong place. They think that, again, it's like thinking metaphorically that you should already have the habit in order to have the habit. Obviously, you're going to be stuck and never have a new habit if you need to already have the habit before you can make a habit. Similarly, you're not going to feel knowledge that you build properly through reason right away necessarily. Sometimes you might see something in a way that's clear and it shifts a category because it can already be triggered in your mind that the category had to shift. Same way you can make a sale sometimes just by shifting one category. Oh, you're on my side. Okay, I'm going to buy. Everything else was already there, but you had to shift one category. Other times it's not a matter of shifting one category. Some sales you're never going to make until you have encounters with the person, you build rapport, and you build trust experiences, SEO splitting, and so forth over days or weeks or months. Right? Some people literally, they're never going to buy it from you realistically for a few months. Just giving you where you're at and where they're at. Literally, it's going to take that long. Same thing with some knowledge. You're not going to feel it in some cases for months or weeks or days or whatever. Some things just shift it and bam. There's a trivial example, but if you're driving and someone cuts you off, and you're like, oh, that person's a jerk. And then you turn and look and it's actually someone you know who you really like. That might shift you, be like, oh, okay, wait, they're not a jerk, right? Like you already had the thing to trigger, just had to shift a category from general other person, random person to, oh, I know who that is, and us, and I like them, and they've done these things for me, and they're not a jerk, right? So it was already there to be triggered if you just had the category blockage removed or you switched the category. So that took me a long time to figure out, by the way, because sometimes you'll have an insight or understanding that you'll get through reason, and you'll feel it. Other times though, but you don't want to be locked out of all those times when it won't be instant. When it comes to God's existence, it might not be instant for you, but it'll come if you go over it and you think it through. But it's definitely true. Again, someone's has the power to and actually is adjusting your conscious field and everyone else's, and doing so in a way that is systematic and has purpose. Otherwise, everything's happening for no reason, and that doesn't check out. The minute something can happen for no reason, anything can happen for no reason, or everything happens for no reason, which means you can't live like that. Oh, one little type of check you can do. If you couldn't live based on a supposed belief, even for a moment, there's a good clue that it's wrong, that you discard it, you act on it. People say money doesn't matter, or I don't care what people think. Those are two things that you can't, or again, I'm just going to use rational emotion. I think, I don't feel. All of those statements are examples of things that you couldn't live on for a day. Try not caring what people think, because it's wrong. You should care what people think, just in the right way. You need to understand how to parse it out. It's like berries. There's a way that you care how people think, and there's a way you don't. right? You don't want to have the goal to like yourself in the wrong way. When I get to discussion, there's something I wanted to elaborate on with Shama mentioning last time about how it helped her, like the idea of learning to love yourself, right? If you mean accepting yourself, of course you don't want to dislike yourself. When I talk about having the goal to like yourself, and I talk about you don't want to be pursuing that goal. You want to be pursuing the actual goal that you want rather than trying to like yourself through the method. The method of liking yourself ends up being your mind looks around at peers, have to figure out what's your peer group, how are they doing, how are you doing in relation to them, how are your results, blah, 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 blah. Right. That's counterproductive as hell, and it takes lots of resource and takes you off course. That's what I'm talking about. If you dislike yourself, that's like the flip side of trying to like yourself. If that's getting in your way, then if someone teaches you to quote unquote love yourself, which means accepting and getting over disliking yourself, then that's helpful given that you're already disliking yourself, right? Now, what I try to do is show you how to get out of that whole game. So you don't, but accepting yourself is fine as long as it's interpreted right. And they can approximate you to the same point if that's where you get. The problem is that someone can get to where they accept themselves, they love themselves, so to speak, by which they mean a useful thing of accepting, right? I presume that's what someone means by the useful part of loving themselves is just accepting oneself. Of course, you should accept everything about how the world currently is, including yourself, right? I've already said it's obviously true, right? What's the opposite? Let's do a check. What's the opposite of accepting how things already are? What would that look like if you don't accept how things are? You don't have to accept that how things are, that default is how you want to be in the future. Of course, I don't accept default as default in the future. So of course I don't mean that, but you accept that how things are is how they are now. What would it look like? Is it just literally denying reality, which is literal insanity, or an assertion that you could change the past or something. And someone might say, maybe you can change the past. All right, try it. There we go. I already told you how to check that. Go ahead and act on that. Act on it for a day that you can change the past. Report back to me how that works out for you. If you discover a way, let me know. But until then, it's like walking into a tree just because you think that objects don't exist. You don't live that way. Everything about what I'm showing you is meant to be practical and day-to-day living. So good. Okay, that starts to be a lot for now. I talked straight for 2 hours. So we can discuss a little bit and then be done. Excellent. Stuff there. I'll refresh and scroll down a bit. I wonder if there's any coffee left in my cup. Hold on one second. Let me check. Good. I'm glad you like that method about the safe space. I think it's a good illustration for you for now, and it's a good way to represent it. Anything's a representation, of that. And but representations are useful as you understand them as representations. I'm not going to discuss which is better, the 60s Star Trek or the new Star Trek from an hour ago. I'll be right back. There is, in fact, some coffee left. You guys are in luck. Good for there. Several minutes. I drank some coffee. Several minutes more than I would have done anyway. Mike said an hour ago, going along with the thread that David is talking about with his instincts being dead on, both relative to other strategic types I'd seen and relative to himself years ago. For me, my timing used to be so lousy. Now it's incredibly good. It shocks me all the time that what I'm able to do, especially when David has his eye on things. Then the timing gets even better is what Mike, right? Justin said, speaking of timing, as a musician, I think of it as this. Timing goes hand in hand with your rhythm, which goes hand in hand with trusting yourself. And that is a result of understanding and putting in the reps. Right, which putting in the reps and understanding is setting your fingers and your sense of rhythm in your mind up, right? Yeah. A musician would be similar to that sword fighter like we talked about, right? You want to get in the zone, but you don't start in the zone. You set yourself up in the zone. You set yourself up with the right parameters, the right conditions, the right beliefs, and so forth. Then you can let go. So the goal can be to let go, but you can't go straight there. You go there by setting yourself up where you can let go. And the other thing is to have red flags, because what are you going to set yourself up to be perfect? No, right? Not yet. Not until you get there, but not like next minute. So you set yourself up decently, and then you have some red flags, right? There's things I would notice, which I tend to not because they don't really happen. But I can notice there's a big enough red flag and I'll know I need to micromanage and come up sometimes. And if there's not, then I don't worry. I don't worry there is. There can't be if there's a big enough problem, I would say how it works. Then you hit that magic level like Michael Jordan just wrote. And the hoop feels like it's 8 feet around. You just can't miss. You've most definitely found your rhythm. It's very evident. Excellent. Great. Exactly. And then you're not in your own way consciously. You don't need to check things over while you're in the zone. But that's what you don't want to conclude, is that being in the zone is the only point of life. Or maybe it is if we get everything perfect. That would look like, again, no bad, but we create more good. So it might be the point ultimately. But currently, until we get things perfect, then we can get in the zone. That's good. But we also need to have that consciously quarantine area sometimes and step back, check on things, or have red flags when to fix things. We could all get in the zone on a local peak and limit our lives. We wouldn't have to reflect and think, but that would just be in denial, and we could be hurting other people and so forth. Bryce said, David, when an intimidating scenario comes up, shouldn't we also keep in mind not to overreact and stay calm? The simplistic answer is yes, but let me just think about how I can relate that to what I've talked about. Part of what you can think quarantine is, look, what's the opposite of not overreacting and not staying calm? Basically panicking and overreacting. So correct. The opposite of what you're saying is wrong, clearly wrong, right? So the opposite of not overreacting and staying calm is panicking and overreacting. You're right. We clearly don't want to do that. And we know we don't want to do it by looking at the opposite. It's not right. Now, do we need to delve in a little bit to, well, David, do I look at the opposite to see if it feels wrong? No, but there's a difference between I'm not saying see if the opposite feels wrong, then obviously we're still stuck in the default feeling if something's right or wrong. There's something other than if it feels wrong, right? There's a kind of a certain clarity that I'll try to hone in on, but I think there's still a way you can notice the difference between, it's not like it just feels wrong to panic and overreact. It's like logically incorrect. So what you would do is say, all right, I know I don't want to panic. Now, if my brain does panic, then I may or may not be able to change that in the moment. I might have some strategies ahead of time. Okay, if I start to panic, such and such, or if I I'm hit with an intimidating scenario, you might picture it. And like my no fear video, you work through how you would do it. And that's an example of a strategy for working through scenarios of if something comes up, like with a habit, or if there's a challenge to your habit or a temptation, and what you would do in that case. That's a way to bridge from the quarantine area that you have intellectually through reason. That's a way to bridge it over to getting it integrated with your mind. That'd be a strategy. So how to do that would be that sort of thing. In the moment, you might be able to help yourself a little bit by think, okay, wait, I don't want to overreact, don't want to panic. How might I do that? And then you'd have some greater or lesser success in the moment. But then you could reflect on it later too. Right. One thing we don't want is things that are going to make us feel bad about when we reflect. That's why guilt is unhelpful. Shame is unhelpful. You don't need to feel bad about the past. That's like having a goal about the past. You just want to make the future better, either by having more good stuff or get rid of some bad stuff. So you can reflect later and think, how could I have dealt with that most optimally? And that doesn't mean you're beating yourself up when you're doing it. Right. Jeff said, love the idea of mastery and competence leading towards confidence and excellence. Right, absolutely. Having that quarantine area. Oh, this isn't this exact same thing. Because the new ones are popping up. I see what's going on. This was just posted, so I can scroll over that too. Let me look here. I'm trying to come back up a little bit, but let me see where that is. Is that here? There's a different thread somewhere else. I guess it was posted on a different thread, not in the OMG way. Sorry, Maria. Maybe you can repost that here in the main thread. Jeff said, mind-blowing talk, covered so many key topics, know thyself, love thyself, need to set some stricter goals, been tracking on that. Good. And what you can do is, again, people can be afraid of setting goals because they hop right to the realistic thing, or again, they might have that background thing of feeling good about themselves. They want to set goals that they can reach. You want to get rid of all that when you're in the quarantine space of ideal, which is like an example of this quarantine space overall. What ideally I want, just what ideally I want in a relationship. What I ideally want in a career. But then even when you're thinking about it, your first impression might not be correct. You might have a list of what you ideally want. And then you, like I mentioned, ideally you might want someone who's a millionaire, and on top of every other quality about what you want in a relationship, you might want to be in a relationship with someone who's a millionaire, right? That might be helpful. But then you might think, well, what if I met someone who's otherwise just awesome, better for me than I've ever seen, or whatever, however you represent that, or even if not better, just there's still something about better when it comes to meeting the person of your dreams. A lot of people, including myself, have had an experience where you meet someone that for you, and given the timing and everything, it's just such a better match experience, like a relationship experience than you had in the past. And so I don't know if that's the only route. That's probably maybe not, right? If that But let's say you notice that. So you imagine that happening. So imagine you're thinking about the ideal theoretically. Then you imagine you meet someone where, oh, wow, this is really something special. It's way over the threshold of what I'm looking for, but they're not a millionaire. What would you do in that case? Ideally, actually, and could you live that way where you say, oh no, you're not a millionaire, so forget it. Or you could think, if you see a friend of yours and they're with a woman who just seems unbelievably amazing, and would you feel like, wow, I want that too? Or would you feel like, oh, that's nothing at all if she's not a million? So there's a number of ways to illustrate that. I'm not saying anyone would really fall into this trap, although I almost did myself, although I wasn't tempted once I met my future wife to not be with her. But I thought, like, I started online dating and there was a whole bunch of prospects and things would move forward with them a little bit. And I felt like I was good at talking to them, and I probably was correct on that. The ones who were matched, not everybody, but there was enough that would hit it off. I was like, well, I might as well just go over someone who's a millionaire on top of everything. I think a lot of people react that way with online dating in front of so many people. Like, wow, there's so many, let me get, and then they go overboard with the ideal. But in reality, yeah, you do that check. And if you check it over, if you could throw out something, then it isn't necessarily the ideal if you're trying to get over a threshold, which is what relationships involve. And so now let's do the ideal check overall with life as a whole. When I say I want things to be perfect, suppose things were nearly perfect. They were pretty amazing compared to they are now, but there were errors in people's minds that were leading to suffering. Would we want to get rid of those? Yes, of course. Simple proof. It'd be ridiculous to say no. There's errors in it. Let's say it was in your mind. There's error in your mind and it leads to suffering for you and other people. Would you want to get rid of it? Even if the world was way better, including your own self, your mind was way better, the world was better, you were much better than you are now because of all your further improvement. Not saying there's any room for improvement with any of us, but supposing there was, then suppose you're way better, but there's still an error that's leading to suffering. It would clearly be absurd, right? To say, yeah, I want to keep that error. That's how I know we want to get rid of them all. That's why it's not so crazy, even though it's out of the box, it's not common for people to say, I want things to be perfect. But it's easy to know that's right because look at almost perfect. And if it's almost perfect, but some errors, wouldn't you want to get rid of them? But now let's look and see, do I want to maximize good? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Suppose there's no errors. Everyone's really happy. We love each other. We create stuff. Couldn't you still create more stuff? A new video game, a new music experience, a new play? Yeah. Would we want to say that's irrelevant? No, it'd be nice. A new play is new stuff. So that's how I figure out, oh, yeah, yet another thing that I know about ideal, and it's a major meta thing that helps guide the rest of it. Yeah, what we're looking for is we get rid of all bad ideas, our minds, and help with others. And it's how I know that look, it's not practical or useful to want to just kill everyone who's wrong about stuff, even with government, just with government, with the extortion. There's so many people that buy into it. It gets absurd to try to kill them all. Even though from another premise, it looks like it makes sense if we, like the way we're raised on movies, like you just take any one of the 80s action movies, right? Some guy's wrong. They kill his wife, daughter, or maybe something less than that. But there's movies, right? Like Steven Seagal, they kill his wife and daughter. And we watch him kill all the people responsible, the whole mafia or whoever it was, the whole group, takes them all down and suddenly and violently and all over the place, right? And we cheer, right? And it feels so right. And I can still feel that to a good degree, but we reason from there, and then we look at people buying into extortion, and the problem is we come to the conclusion we need to kill all them too, right? As I said, like practically speaking, it's like burning my house down every year for the last several years. It would have been probably cheaper for me if they burned down my house rather than just taxed me with federal tax in many cases. And I wouldn't have had to figure out the taxes. They just burn it down, please don't move some. Anyhow, but it's at least equivalent. So clearly in an 80s action movie, someone burns down the guy's house and they're going to do it again, and they do it several years running, and they're going to keep doing it. Then, and you watch, and that there's a group of people doing it, we would cheer as they kill them all, right? But do I want to really cheer and kill every single person involved with government, right? There's a lot of practical problems with that, and you can't kill your way to getting rid of all bad ideas, right? Some of them are on our own head, right? And so what we actually end up proving, if we think about it properly, is those movies are wrong, even though it's virtually every movie has it. I remember one movie didn't have that. Kevin Costner was called Revenge, and we were all excited to see him kick the crap and kill the bad guy at the end. At the end, he ends up apologizing or something to the bad guy. The bad guy, like, basically Kevin Costner slept with it, like this mafia figure's wife or something. And boy, did that back on Kevin Costner. And he basically was left for dead. I think they killed the woman and left him for dead. And the whole movie was him tracking this guy down and getting ready to get revenge. And then at the end, he basically lets go and apologizes. And boy, was I pissed off with that at the time, right? My teenage years. I watched the whole movie for this crap. Never wanted to see Kevin Costner again in any movie. I don't know that I was missing out on much, but why that? But regardless. But the funny thing, or the ironic thing is that it turns out, and we can look at this in other ways, that justice, even though we feel it all, myself included, like we feel it, it's so ingrained everywhere that we want justice. But if you look at what justice entails, people even think that God wants justice and that God upholds justice sometimes, like ultimately in some way. But it's crazy. Justice involves like doubling down on all bad. You're not going to get rid of bad by doubling it. And that also relates to this other huge meta problem of the greater good, right? That bad stuff, truly bad stuff, property rights violation, can be justified through some supposed public good or greater good or some other. But no, true violations don't lead to good, period. I'm trying to think of my quick proof of that. Where does it lead if we suppose that trampling on individual rights, practically speaking, we can see the results, right? Where we're at each other's throats and it's not nice. But then in seeing how we can't love with the same money that's taken. And I'm not like political rant here. It's just good parallel, but it's a nice thing to look at. And I'm explaining why I don't want justice, right? Because justice isn't the goal, right? Justice will kill everyone, or every time someone does something bad, we have to do an equal amount of bad double to that person. There might be a practical short-term thing on that. I'm not really making a comment. It's a tough thing. What do we do in society? What do you do personally if someone's coming after you? But overall, as an ideal, justice is not the goal. The goal is to get rid of the bad ideas, and you don't get rid of bad ideas by killing. You might kill off one person, including their ideas, but first of all, it's overkill in a sense, right? Then we might think, when do we have to be violent? And it would, if anything, and we might suspect that we might even rise above this, but if anything, it would be like in an emergency to keep things going. You know what I mean? To not have everything wiped out or ourselves wiped out, right? Certainly some amount of self-defense and some maybe minimal amount of self-defense. It's hard to know. And I suspect there's an even more enlightened view, but I look for it, but I don't have it yet. Again, it's okay. Like part of how you get to knowledge is being comfortable when you don't know something, comfortable with gray until it's not. If you're uncomfortable with gray and you just need to get to the answer fast, that's how you lock yourself out of getting to real truth, right? So giving you just a sense of what I'm at and what I mean by that stuff with justice. And it's interesting. Like we don't fundamentally want it. It's not what God wants either. And once you know to look for it, if you look at what Jesus said, and again, nothing I'd say about Jesus presumes that you have to believe in Jesus. It's just interesting to relate sometimes or look what Jesus is a historical figure, of course, and said, but Jesus over and over again went against the idea of justice, and example after example, with the who's going to throw the first stone, or that he was without sin to the first stone, and then I don't condemn you either. Or the parable with the workers on a vineyard, and how he hired some people early in the day and they worked all day and he promised them a certain wage. And then he gave the same wage to people that started in the evening and only worked for part of the evening. He said, can I pay what I want? And am I shortchanging you? I'm giving you what I promised you, $100. He said 1 talent, which is a unit of money back then. And then he gave the same amount to people that started later. Over and over again, it's not justice. It's looking for goodness, right, instead of justice, or getting rid of the wrong ideas. What does Jesus get angry about? Hypocrisy, which is inherent contradictions. Contradictions are what lead to bad problems and so forth. You find a contradiction. That's when Jesus went, when it looked like he was like mad, like at least appeared mad or angry, or at least really rebuking people, was contradicting themselves. Someone commits adultery and people are going to stone the woman, and he let them go. I won't condemn you. Someone does something that's an inherent contradiction or teaches it to others, and Jesus rebukes them. So it's an interesting to see the contrast, right? It's not that he said that adultery is okay. He would say that it's not. But he didn't. He said, especially, I don't condemn them. And yet it's hypocrisy, or I use the example of when Peter said at the Last Supper, said, no, Jesus, no, we don't want you to get taken by the guards. When he said, I'm going to get taken away. And maybe he even said he'd be like arrested, killed. He'd be like, no, that's an inherent contradiction, because Peter affirmed that Jesus was God or the Son of God or the Messiah. And now Peter is acting like he knows better than Jesus, which doesn't make any sense, right? So that's a contradiction. And Jesus replied with the astonishing, get behind me, Satan, when Peter said, no, let's not let you get, and yet again, the woman's in adultery or whatever, and Jesus doesn't condemn. So it just, at least that there's a parallel, that there's a reflection. It doesn't make it true to Solomon that it's not a proof saying that Jesus said it. It's just that it's an interesting parallel. Shema says, thanks for elaborating on loving self. At first glance, I think of accepting self as being non-emotional, and loving self seems to have feeling to it. So I find it urged to want more than just self-experience, to have feeling. Okay, so let's take a look, because this is a great example about loving yourself. There's a number of interpretations of loving yourself, potential interpretations that I don't mean actual or not, but potential, that are helpful. And let's look at what they might be. So you remember, there's yourself is not you. Yourself would be your brain, your mind, personality, beliefs, that sort of thing. Okay. We can call that yourself. There's you, who's the one having your experience, right? You're conscious of stuff. And that's you. You're the being that's conscious. For those of you who haven't heard this before, at least this is a quick introduction to it. I can elaborate more next to subject. Yourself is not conscious. It's where the stuff is stored, right? It's the beliefs. Beliefs themselves are not conscious. Your brain itself is not conscious. It assists with the whole system of you, or the reasons why you're conscious of what you're aware of, rather than something else, right? Your beliefs are part of the reason why you're aware of what you're aware of, and why your body does what it does, and why you'll affirm what you affirm, or why you feel thought that you feel rather than something else. So your beliefs, or yourself is involved, including your beliefs, yourself, which includes your beliefs, is involved in what you experience, but it is not itself aware of what you're, it's just information or code or whatever you think. So you wouldn't love, if we understand love, right? And I have a specific constructed definition of love that is not just a more extreme version of, I understand that in practical speech, we use love in multiple ways, including, I really like it. That means I love it, right? I love my car. I'm not saying I do. I'm saying as an example of how someone might talk. They might say, I love my car, which means I really like it, right? Or I love your car. Or someone might do something that makes someone feel really good. They'd be like, oh, I love you so much for doing that for me. I'm not the word police. It doesn't matter how someone talks. But in terms of concepts, there's two different concepts. There's liking, which involves liking how something makes you feel ultimately, right? So you can like an object or self or another person's self, another person's actions, in terms of that's how they make you feel, or how you perceive is a much more accurate. Not how they make you feel directly, but how you perceive they make you. That's why you would like something. Love is totally different. Love is, in my constructed definition, a very specific, narrow meaning, but that makes sense out of thinking. You can think more clearly with this correct, specific, honed definition. Is something that you can only have for someone that's morally conscious, that can have better or worse experience. And to love another person is how to want them to have better, more goodness rather than bad, right? More good experience rather than bad conscious experience. That's love. And you can only love a conscious being. And it has nothing to do with how that person is you perceive to make them feel, or it's nothing intrinsically, but the logic that has to be that. It has to do with how you want them to feel. And then how much you love them, there can even be degrees to this, is how many resources of your limited resources you're willing to pay, so to speak, spend in order for that person to have more good experience. And since we have a limited resources, in that way, our love in terms of how much resources we are willing to spend is limited. In the sense of, do we want everyone, at least by intention, without resources being spent, do we want them to all be better off than? So ideally, there's a correct answer to that, which is we want everyone, no matter who they are, even Osama bin Laden or Barack Obama in my case, who I loathe in terms of his actions, because we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in specific tax that he specifically as a person fought for on me. So I loathe him in that way. But do I want him to have bad experience? No. Do I love Obama? Do I like Obama? No. In the sense of liking, as negative as possible. In the sense of, or hopefully not think about. I don't want Obama to trigger bad feelings myself. I don't want anything to trigger bad. But in terms of loving, do I want Obama as a being to have badness? No. I want only goodness for Obama as a being. I want Obama's bad, terrible ideas that I think have a horrific impact on the world. I want them to be gone. But I want Obama the being to only be as well off as possible. If I knew that the being would be well off, even if Obama's self was killed, but that he would live again in some way and be happy and everything, then I wouldn't to have necessarily a problem. Although again, you can't beat ideas just by killing them. So again, I don't think that. But would I shed a tear? No. So it's not the same thing as herself, them as a being. I don't really think about it one way or the other. Luckily, I don't think it's illegal anymore to think or talk about that. I think it was Obama was president, so I didn't go there. But I'm just trying to use that as an example to parse things out. But love, when we understand properly, would have for everyone in the general sense, we want them all to be better as a being. How many resources we spend helps explain the idea of degrees of love for various people and how it's specific for various individuals. So it's all pretty coherent. Okay, so relating this to yourself. So now you can't love yourself by my definition. Of course, through other common usages, you could, but my usages make sense out of the world. The other ones, the ways people normally use the word liking and loving are all blurry and confused. So you can't really make sense of it. Once I define terms as I have, then you certainly accept yourself because yourself is the way it is right now and you accept everything. You actually accept everyone's in one sense. Then there's the question of saying, have I done a good job so far up till now? That's not a good question to ask. That's the wrong question. Where are you going to go with that? Now you're just trying to like yourself. It's a nonsense question. What's it going to lead to? Have I done a good job up till now? The question should be, the only use in that is to the extent that it's helping you if that was a sub question, basically it's not going to be useful no matter what. But if it's some sort of subset somehow of how can I do the best job I can, what's the method by which I can maximize goodness in my life and therefore in others, right? Goodness in the way that it leads to more goodness. And the roots of goodness, which is correct understood ideas, correct understanding of what's true and important regarding what will lead to good, that will lead to good for yourself and others. Correct understanding of what's going to lead to bad and contradictions will remove things that predictably will lead to bad for yourself and others. So you want to think, what's the method by which I can interact with myself, right? Use the fact I'm conscious, etc., to maximize things and then work on that. And then once you're there, once you understand that, now all these questions about loving yourself fall to the wayside. It bypasses it, like that whole peak is not relevant anymore. Once you're on that peak of having to deal with yourself and whether you love yourself, accept yourself, and so forth, then you might as well love yourself rather than not, for the most part. Although that peak itself is limited, because why should you love anything? First of all, you don't love an object. And then if you're talking about love yourself as a being, of course, right? And there could be beliefs that a person could have that cause them to get a good payoff out of things that also hurt. So you have this inherent cognitive dissonance. You don't want that. So if someone feels like that they deserve hurt, then yeah, you sure as heck don't want that. But instead of doing that in a local peak way of, oh, I don't deserve to be hurt because I've done a good job. That's not why you deserve. Then you're stuck having to convince yourself that you've done a good enough job. So therefore you don't deserve to get hurt. And what if you haven't done a good enough? The problem with that is you don't want to acknowledge wrong ideas very well. You want to protect yourself from being aware of what's wrong ideas because you want to believe you've done a good enough job. And therefore you don't deserve punishment. Instead, no one deserves punishment for anything. The only reason for punishment ever, there may never be a reason. If there is one, it would be as an economic thing to get people to not behave in ways that are really detrimental. There might be some point at which we need to publicly have punishments for certain violations. And I don't have that figured out. But no other reason for punishment, really, right? If you need it because you have a deeper misconception, then, like I say, heroin addicts are better off taking heroin, in the short term, right? But they're better off getting off of it altogether. So anything to do with needing to believe that you're already good is like being a heroin addict. And it's really costly and it's really terrible. You want to accept that whatever happened in the past happened. There's going to be wrong ideas in your mind, presumably, because we live in a cesspool that has wrong ideas. But there's right ideas and good, and there's love, and there's lots of correct stuff. And we can walk around in the world and not run into objects. And we can do stuff and achieve results sometimes. So I'm not being blanket criticizing the world, but there's certainly bad ideas out there. And we're going to have absorbed some of them, for goodness sakes, right? It only comes down to filtering. That's why it's all about the filter and its quarantined area. And then focus there. And then again, you don't need to. So that'll start to give you a bunch more insight on things relating to that topic. And so last thing, as a being, you would want to love yourself in that you would want to yourself to have a good experience. Then it's a question of resources, which is an interesting question. What do you do in terms of spending resources on yourself, right? Remember I talked about, see, my worldview is so coherent that it keeps holding. Everywhere I poke with it, it keeps shedding more light on itself rather than leading to more confusion. Normally when people think about topics like loving themselves, consciousness, goals, they get tangled up and their views start to conflict and they get confused. What you'll spot here is that it keeps helping this framework that I've given you. So I already have it predicted in advance. Okay, there's love in general. We want people to have a better conscious experience, right? Better than worse, right? But what about resource spending? I already covered that. There's an additional sense of love, which has to do with how much resource you're willing to spend. Then in that case, how many resources should you spend on yourself? Jesus had a suggestion about this, which one of the ways that I developed my ideas was I studied what Jesus said and in a way of helping it, not in terms of memorizing and believing my interpretation. That's what normally people do, and it's not helpful compared to what they should do. They just end up reinforcing their own ideas that way. What you want to do is allow all the anomalies between what Jesus said and how we normally think to try to break you out of your thinking, and that was really helpful. What Jesus suggested regarding love for self was what? That you should be totally selfless? No. It was interesting. He actually picked a place. He said you should love people equally, second commandment, right? In Jesus's view of what is the highest commandment. And Jesus actually gave two, right? This was in the same place as the eye and the needle story, right? The guy, I'm sorry, I might be messing that up. Anyway, no, I'm sorry, this is not. But although I think it's in the same group of parables, at least one of the books, but it doesn't matter. Someone asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And part of it, people would try to trap Jesus. Other times there's genuine questions. And Jesus, what's interesting is Jesus gave two, which is saying something. Jesus didn't give 10. Jesus didn't give one. So Jesus must have thought that two were particularly special. And as a matter of fact, Jesus reinforced it because when Jesus gave two, Jesus said all the other commandments are wrapped up in those two things. And I'm going to point out another parallel in what Jesus said and what I'm saying, which is, again, in either direction. Either you respect me, and this might cause you to take a look at Jesus, or you respect Jesus, it might cause you to have more confidence in what I'm saying and how it doesn't conflict, or you just think I'm a kook. Anyhow, so Jesus picked two, which is interesting, not 10, not one. And then Jesus went on to say everything's summed up in these two. And what do I say separately? I say you can sum up morality, two things, property rights in terms of bad morality, and then love in terms of a good, abundant type of morality. And you combine them both, and you have a shortcut to everything, which is particularly helpful, not in terms of being moralistic, but because people clutter. The reason that morality has a practical value, and I talked about it in an OMG webinar, is very practical in that people have all these additional moralities, even the gay thing, like I talked about, right? For some people, I don't think a lot of you tend to be libertarian here, but it's just an example. People have all these additional, I should do this, I got to do that, I got to eat lunch with my family, I got to go to my in-laws, right? Or my parents invited me for Christmas, I got to celebrate this government, right? You notice that every holiday is, by the way, a government holiday. Doesn't mean you should never celebrate holidays, but it's just the government stuff. So again, people literally think it's more like their moral responsibility to celebrate certain holidays and not work on those. And by narrowing down morality, I'm not being moralistic or giving you a lecture. I've said this before, I'm decluttering you from all the cultural crap that gets cluttered that interferes with us earning money. Or people literally even think that earning money can be immoral because maybe they're grabbing it from someone else, but you're not, right? Money's not a fixed amount. So morality gets in people's way. That's why I try to narrow it down. So I said those two things. Jesus, and this relates to loving yourself, where to draw the line. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your mind and soul, heart, mind, and soul. I believe that's a reasonable translation, or that's the right thing. But it's something like that tantamount. And it's interesting that God picked three things too, but regardless, or at least picked a few different ways to represent it. So God was trying to give some things. But that goes for the goodness, that we want goodness for people no matter what. Because if you love God fully and totally, no matter what, like with everything, with all you own, with all your heart, your soul, everything, heart, mind, and soul, then whatever people do to you, you want goodness for them because God created them. God's literally aware of their experience. If they experience bad, God has to experience bad. So that's your route to goodness, no matter what. And then I guess it doesn't parse out perfectly with the property rights and the love, but anyway, love your neighbor as yourself. You basically about equal, right? Resources, about equal resources for caring for others, for helping others have better experience than yourself. You don't have to sacrifice everything of your own according to that, according to at least that barometer. But about half your resource can go into stuff that you want for yourself or people that are like yourself. Sometimes your family, your close relationship, your wife or husband or whatever, something like that for you, whatever. Like partner basically amounts to what you want to spend on yourself and then maybe about half for other people. Or maybe it means you have to take care of yourself first, have your own airbag, right? Have your own money that you need as basic comfort for your life. And then you can devote resources to other people, however you interpret it. But it's about like that. So in terms of resources on ourselves for things that are easy for us, maybe about half. Ultimately. Maybe that means we have to get our needs taken care of first, but then ultimately hope to spend the rest of it on other people. So it doesn't have to be half in terms of actual money or not. I don't mean that. But just, he didn't say half and half. He said equal tiers. I'm responsible for myself, my body, and for my immediate family. I'm in his way responsible for my child. So I take care of maybe my responsibility first, but I don't trample on the rights of other people just to give my family again. More insight than on loving yourself but yet, unless you take it in terms of resources, you might be missing a significant thing that you can't really act on until you get the full thing. So the resource thing helped to round that out. Jeff said, mind-blowing talk covered so many key topics. Oh, yeah, we saw that before. Bryce said, thank you, David, for today's never disappoint. Your semi-soft lock methodology and meta strategies will help me in closing clients at the networking events coming up. Exactly. But if they're going to become my client, then they'll at least do such and such. And I like that we covered earlier when I pointed out that just like with some habits or some beliefs, you can get them instantly by looking at it a certain way. Some people you can sell instantly by being in a certain category or appearing in a few categories, competent, like in us, or you have a service they're looking for, it's like instant. The reason I point this out is you can feel like, oh, that's how it always should be. No, it won't always be instant. With some people, it can never be instant, and you don't have to look like you're doing something wrong. And you don't necessarily have to limit yourself to only people where it's instant or only beliefs. I was, for a long time, I thought maybe if there's a certain way to understand certain truths where you instantly feel it. And I thought that I just needed to find a method for that. It took me forever to figure out that sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it won't happen instantly. It isn't a matter of finding the thing that makes it instant. You're not doing it wrong just because you don't feel it for a while with some beliefs, as far as I can tell. And that helped free me up because I was looking, maybe it should always be instant. If you understand it well enough, you could feel it right then. And I think that as far as I know now, I won't say I understand this perfectly, but my current understanding looks like the thing that looks most right is that it isn't like that with everything. And that it's almost counterproductive to think that if you understand something well enough, you'll feel it right away. Similarly, sales with clients, it's not about everyone's going to say yes right away, even if you get the categories right. And sometimes it naturally will take a while. And I think knowing that lets us stop second guessing ourselves and also, or stop feeling like, oh, I'm going to enjoy rejecting that person because they don't say yes right away. No, that's wasteful. Anthony, David, have you ever covered the concept of trust in LOI? Covered respect. I don't know if I covered trust. That's a good practical thing to think about because trust is very relevant with sales. It's very relevant with relationships, romantically or in business. Could you briefly cover how you look at trust, gaining it, losing it, building it, trust relationships, business, romantic, otherwise? Thanks for all you do. Let's see what comes to mind as I do look at it quickly, and then I might visit in the future. One way that I'm keeping my word is relatively important to me. I'm willing to spend a significant amount of resources on it I consider it to be important. If we check and see if keeping your word needs to happen no matter what, that instantly looks like it wouldn't work. If I said I'd be on this webinar, but my son was having a medical emergency and it was necessary for me to drive somewhere, then that would just a random example of you could look to the extreme, right? I'm doing my check that I told you about. I want to have you start with, or kind of start by at least doing that consistently and building on seeing when to check and then how to check. But so keeping your word no matter what doesn't quite work. However, I consider it a high importance, right? With keeping my word, and it's worth a lot, like a good amount of resources. I know. And this isn't the only thing I'll say about trust, but I'm poking for a foothold, and this is one place where I'm making some headway as I look at it. So with keeping my word, it's not, one thing it isn't, is when it's time to keep my word, I don't look and see, in the absence of giving my word, is it like a good decision now? Is it into my advantage? Like, it's not a bang per buck question. If there's an absolute, something that would take absolute priority, then that would be one thing. And even then I would look, like, depending on, in the case of my son having a medical emergency and a webinar like this, I would take a look at the kind of relative situation. I would take a look at the relative situation. Is there another way that's just as reasonable for him to get to the hospital? If it's a Crushing the Game webinar, it'd be easy for me to cancel because I could reschedule it. If it's a major thing that a lot of people that are partners with or members are counting on for their welfare, like if for some reason it was a meeting with somebody right before they were going to meet with an important client, and I was and they were counting on me to help them, and it was going to really mess their life up or their financial life up if I didn't show up, then I would still balance. If it was my son's life, of course I would still pick that. Oh, if it was my son was sick, but it wasn't life-threatening, but it was life-threatening for someone else, then I had to think that I might pick that. But you look at it, I'm looking at extremes, not because I think of that, but that's where you start to look at, right, this is my method for starting to understand something. You look the extremes don't shed a lot of light on the details sometimes at first, but I don't stop with the extreme. I just let it I start to get a sense of where to look and where not to look by looking at it. So what I don't do when it comes to keeping my word, let's say we're going to promote somebody. If the time comes to promote them, like an affiliate that might have promoted us and we said we'd promote them. If we didn't say we'd promote them and we were clear about that, then I would give it less of a priority. But if I said I would, then I wouldn't look and see if it was good timing, for example, unless they had flexibility and it was better for them. But just in the question of keeping my word, I don't look at the timing for me, if it's or how many resources it's going to take me. It would really only be if I would only break a word if it was like a category thing, not like an amount or resource thing. Like the category thing is like my son or anyone has like a life-threatening emergency. That category would take precedence over a discussion that we could have at a different time, right? That sort of thing. But I don't look at resource management with trust. When it comes to you commit to a marriage, for me, it really is a strong thing, right? It's not really a matter of if someone else comes by or if I thought that I think I don't want to be in it. It's hard. I don't have a lot of temptation either because my wife is great. I'm very happy to be married to her. But there's been a few times that it's been hard involved with having a child. I really didn't want to be a father. And yet in balance, I wanted to have a child because it was important to her. So it wasn't like a tug of war in that way, but it still created a challenge. The first year, my son was really very difficult in terms of waking up constantly. Like I look at people walking their kid around out and just, they sit there. There's no such thing as taking them. Till I saw someone of them, they took their son to the barbershop the other day and they had a younger child as well that was just in their arms. And that kind of thing just wouldn't be possible. My wife basically couldn't even leave the house for about a year, hardly, because it was just so difficult. So things like that were tough. And it's tough when I didn't want to be a father in the first place. And then it was tough on her for that first year and all that. But I'm exploring. I'm talking about myself just to look at it. So it's not really an alternative use thing, like in terms of keeping word. I know that's not the only thing about trust, but trust certainly has a tremendous value in business that you really want to pay attention to. I'll tell you what I pay attention to is people will look in parallel. Sometimes people operate in a way where they don't seem to realize that, like, people will breach trust in a way that other people will see, and they'll do it like a lot. And they don't realize that they're doing it in a way. So if someone says, sometimes people tell me something, they say, please don't tell anyone. And what I'll do is I won't tell anyone. Literally, not my wife, nobody, not Mike, who's my closest friend, and so forth. If I say I'm not going to tell him, if for some reason I needed to, if someone I'm going to go after Mike and attack him, don't tell him, I would do something, right? So I'll of course talk about things that wouldn't that wouldn't otherwise hurt them. But what's very common is people will say, don't tell anyone, I'm not supposed to tell anyone this, I'm telling you. And they'll try to gain trust that way, right? By revealing someone else's secret. But the trouble is what that does, it's a lot like behaviorism. It's not the same thing as behaviorism, but it's the same thing in the meta sense of you do something that helps in the moment, but it creates a vector against you overall. So it's like deficit spending or something where you get a payoff now, but it creates the conditions against you in the future, right? Or it might create a condition for you in the future while simultaneously creating a condition against you. I find plenty of other ways to build trust with Mike or my wife rather than revealing other people's secrets to them. Right. So I build another way, but I don't do that because that backfires. And so you realize, of course, that someone's not very trustworthy if they're telling you something. Now they could make it like we have a special relationship. I don't have a special relationship with that person. And they could try to categorize it that way, but ultimately, come on. So that's a big thing that's a big thing that I look out for with myself that I don't do. I don't not trust people who do it, but I understand that they do it. And so I don't in that one way. I also parse out trust. Sorry, the idea of it. What I do is I try to understand not whether this is pretty helpful. I try to figure out, I don't think whether I trust somebody. I try to figure out more how I trust them. It's like the question of competence. And relates also to how I talk about, you don't generalize morality or even generalize competence. I don't think whether someone's competent. I think how they're competent. And then I also might notice weaknesses, but not once you're not looking to be superior or looking if someone's competent overall, then you notice weaknesses just to help set them up well, right? Okay, they're strong here, they're weaker here. They want to do this, they don't want to do that. Great, that all helps me set them up better. So same thing with trust. I understand with various people that I don't trust them to tell nobody about something, right? So I just won't even put them in that position. Nearly everyone I know, I basically don't trust nobody. And so and what I also do is I don't set people up for failure. I don't ask questions. I've talked about this before. I don't ask questions of people where there's a right answer and a wrong answer. And that actually relates to trust because you ask somebody a question where they're incentivized to mislead you because they know that you want them to say yes rather than no. Did you brush your teeth? I don't ask them that if there's a right answer and a wrong answer. I don't ask someone I work with, I don't know, are you going to do a webinar this week? If I prefer that they do, if I prefer that they do, I say, ideally you do a webinar unless there's a reason not to. I'd phrase it in a way where I let them know what I'm looking for and what the parameters are. If I want to let them out of it, if there's good reasons, then I phrase it in such a way where I might say in a vacuum, I would have you do a webinar. There are reasons why it'd be better for you not to, talk about that. So I don't ask questions where they think where there's a right or wrong answer. Based on culture, they might still assume I'm doing so. I try to say I'm not, but even then they might not believe me. But then over time, they get to know me better and they might have a better chance to see that, or they might never know that. But at least if I don't do it, it helps them to feel that. So I never, literally, and I pretty much probably am able to almost literally never do this. Some things in life you can't do in practice, like all the time. I would say in practice, I pretty much do this almost or even fully literally. I don't know if it's perfect or not. But it's something where you can really do it pretty consistently, I think, theoretically. Not ask right or wrong questions. Again, those actually erode trust. So like with anything, like with getting someone to like me or getting to do something, what I do is I look at accomplishing results. Just if I'm looking to build trust, I look at it as a collection of layers or vectors. And so I try to be aware of, because it's a useful use of resources. I'm not trying to be aware of everything, but I try to be aware of things that like factors that erode trust or factors that build trust. And then you become a bit of a student for that. And I could elaborate on that even further if I talk about the topic specifically, but I just gave you a couple of examples. Don't ask questions where there's a right or wrong answer. If there's a right answer, let them know ahead of time and let them know the parameters. Like there's a great example with the webinar, right? There might be a right answer in a vacuum, and I'll literally use the phrase, in a vacuum is a good phrase. Right? I would prefer this, but there might be reasons that I don't know why you might not want to do it. Publicly, I count that there to be a cost to publicly doing something where I'm not upkeeping an alliance anyway, or I'm having a breakup with somebody publicly in business. If it has to happen, it has to happen. So it's not like an absolute, but I try to avoid it. One of the biggest ways I avoid breaking my word or breaking up with a person, breaking up an alliance, like with a person or whatever, is to try to be careful in the first place with when I give my word or when I affirm that we have an alliance. So that starts to elaborate on it. But particularly look out for public things that people can spot where I'm not being trustworthy. And again, a lot of how I do it is I don't give my word, like the gray area. I'll try to avoid giving word, making appointments unless I need to, and so forth. But there's times you just need to make appointments. So there's a benefit to making alliances. There's a benefit to giving your word. You just try to count the cost ahead of time a bit and eyeball it reasonably. And just by eliminating the obvious times when you shouldn't, that tends to, again, you eliminate like 90% of the errors. Like so many errors are just a little bit of doing this. I think you'll catch a lot of stuff. Maria says, thank you, David. This is so rich. I love the safe quarantine space. Getting to the gym consistently was a habit I wanted to install, and the opposite one is unacceptable. So it feels natural, right? As the actions I take in spite of my feelings. Good. Yeah. Yeah. And for some people, it's easier. Some people, it's harder, different habits. But knowing that you're not supposed to feel it, knowing that space is, there's a Again, like you get on the wrong peak, you get locked out of creating new habits by thinking you should feel them sooner than you. And people that do feel them right away will imply to you that you should feel it right away. And knowing that's not the case is huge. I think it's such a problem when some theists tell non-theists that they're supposed to feel like God exists, if they had enough faith or belief or something. No. Some people feel like going to the gym naturally and some people don't naturally. Everyone can build the habit, but if you tell them, someone that doesn't feel it naturally, that they're supposed to feel it right away, they'll give up because they think they're doing it wrong. When you know you aren't going to feel it for a while, again, it's like you wouldn't be able to sell clients that would take months. Do a test, right? Mark down this date, know to ask yourself in 3 or 6 months, would it have been worth it if you had to, like, it might feel like you want to sell some right away. It might feel like 6 months is a long time, but in 6 months, I bet it'll feel like it would have been worth it. What's funny is, let's say you're 35, 45, whatever. There's 25-year-olds that might be looking at OMG. They might say, oh, I need it to work within 3 months, or is it going to work within a year? It's not worth it. Then you're 35, look at that, think, oh my goodness, if I could be a millionaire by something I started when I was 25, even if it took me 5 or 10 years, would have been worth it, of course. So it's funny, you look at things different ways that way. Christian says, and I'll wind this down the next 5 minutes. Oh, a repost. Okay, so I see it. David, what do you think about willpower and training it? Should you do something when you feel resistance to train that muscle, or should you first take a step back and look if you've set your goals and priorities? Okay. As a meta idea, I know that we don't want to struggle as a matter of course. Like it isn't that we want to get good at struggling. Like I don't want to get good at swimming upstream. In a sense, I want to be good at swimming upstream when I need to swim upstream. Like in other words, suppose you're navigating currents and streams. Ultimately, you want to be good at navigating the currents themselves. But of course, if you run into a current against you, you do want to be good at swimming against it. So in life, you want to be good theoretically, to the extent that it's good use of resource and so forth, but ideally, and then we can figure out resource management. But ideally, if you have to swim upstream, then you want to do a good job of it. But if that's all that someone does is swim upstream, and what people will do is they'll take pride in their ability to swim upstream, like their ability to overcome obstacles is common. And you'll hear this in various ways all over the place. And to the extent that he even talks about this iconic book called How We Know It Isn't True. And he says it's really funny if you listen to two people playing tennis. He said you would think like they basically what they do is they'll be playing tennis like he listens to he's a professor, listen to professors playing tennis. And he'll say like all it is about how many disadvantages that. And it's like natural thing. Oh, I hope I do well today. I haven't worked out for a while, or I haven't played tennis in so long, or my hip hurts me today, or didn't drink my coffee. And then it's funny, like, why is that? And it's because that the people we value like overcoming obstacles rather than achieving a result, right? Like they don't they don't want to talk about, oh, I'm winning or I'm doing well. Instead, they talk about the great obstacles they're overcoming that day in playing tennis. So people can get in this frame where it's all about overcoming obstacles. And then if we check that in life, do we want to, it can look right. Do I want to be good at overcoming obstacles? But how about avoiding obstacles? How about, do I want to be good at swimming against currents, or do I want to also be good at least at navigating currents so they're in my favor? At least both. And then the minute we have limited resources, where are your resources better spent in the long run in understanding the currents or in fighting against the existing current, right? So if you have to choose resources, you generally want to work on navigating the currents. In other words, you want to change default, not fight against default. Ultimately, you want to understand and get good at changing default. Now, willpower can mean different things. You certainly want to get good at acting on a potential habit or belief that you know to be correct, even if you don't feel it. That's good. That's not so much a muscle necessarily. In one sense, it's its own habit of where you're looking. In that case, it's not really a willpower struggle. What you really want to get good at is looking in the right place that's going to give you something useful. A quick example of looking in the wrong place is if, I go on one of my rants about taxes and then you're thinking about that for a while, then that's not helpful for work, right? You're looking in the wrong place for problems. So you don't want to notice that at the wrong time. Or if someone just broke up with you and you're thinking about that right when you otherwise would want to be working, you're looking in the wrong place. So if you have this model that where you categorize, oh, I don't feel that I want to do this habit, that I expect that given my model. And now I'm looking to see what's the habit I do want, not whether I'm feeling it in terms of what's correct. You still might not go to the gym that day, but at least you don't kill off that quarantine. The real risk, the real thing that you want to keep is your foothold. How fast that foothold takes root in terms of being integrated and being a habit, there's a number of conditions there, and conditions are different for different people, for yourself, depending on so much, right? The same exact person that might not want to go to the gym, they get divorced, and now all of a sudden nothing else changed. Their willpower didn't change, nothing changed, but they got divorced, and now they're going to the gym. No problem, effortless, right? So once you see that, then you know really it's not about willpower, how people think. And this whole idea that willpower is a thing, I think it ultimately kind of dissolves. And I don't really think about willpower. I think about creating conditions and footholds and making progress in a sense of understanding, getting vectors on my side. And that's really effective for me. So that's how I do it, is I bypass the whole issue. And that's ultimately the good thing. I'm going to have to end things here. I plan next time on mostly doing discussion about this topic, about the method. I think we framed it so that it didn't look disconnected from practicality, which is great. That's my whole puzzle, whole obstacle. And there's a number of kind of things I've had to solve in terms of explaining the method of knowing what's true and having it be relevant, having it not be misunderstood, not be blocked out, the different things. But I think we're navigating it well. And I'll even refer to the same thread next discussion. Maybe I'll even post the same thread. So it is the same discussion thread. Take a look at it. We can talk about some new stuff, but we can also take a look at some of what was posted this time in 2 weeks. Wonderful. Got a boom from Mike. Excellent. You're welcome. Where is this thread here? Look. It says 124. It says OMG away. Okay, so this should be right here. Fascinating. Why didn't I find it? It says OMG away. And yeah, I didn't see it on the thread that one time. But anyway, that puzzle for another day. When I don't see it again, you might know the answer to this, some of you already, but I'll figure it out by next time how it could be different. Great. Okay, well, guys, thank you so much. Wonderful discussion as always. Lots of comments. I know I didn't do too much discussion this time, but it's been good about it. No, we had some really great prompting statement that covers some good stuff. You're very welcome. So bizarre. Am I in a different thread? I don't think I am. The wrong one. All right. Anyway, I'll end this here and get something to eat. And right, it's the same one. You're very welcome, Justin. Okay, just curious about that with the posting. All right, I'll take a look and see if there's some kind of glitch or something. Good night, guys. Good night, all of you. Wonderful to have you on and appreciate y'all. And I'm happy. This is a very nice webinar. And I don't know yet when I start, although I suspected it'd be some good stuff today. And I look forward to 2 weeks from now. Should be a great discussion. Oh, maybe I see. I see what happened. There's a previous thread from last webinar that got right near the top. And that's where the posting, that's why I'm seeing a bunch of posts and it looks the same. Okay, so a few of the posts have been in last week's post. A few of the comments in last week's post that clears up the mystery for anyone wondering. Okay, guys, awesome. I appreciate you so much, and I'll talk to you soon. Welcome, James and Robin and Megan and Luke and Desmond.